Hello everyone and welcome back to the Horror Hut. Now, I know a lot of you use these videos to sleep, so before you drift off I thought it would be a nice idea if everyone can leave a comment and let me know where you are listening from in the world. Also like and subscribe if you are enjoying the episodes. Right, let's get comfy and relax and let's begin. I never thought I'd be the kind of person who would fall for something like this. You always hear about these kinds of stories, right? People getting scammed or tricked, but you never imagine it'll happen to you. I always thought I was a pretty cautious person, but somehow, I let my guard down one evening, and everything changed. It was a regular Thursday night. I was leaving work late. My office is on the edge of town, in a part of the city where the buildings are old and the streets are quiet by the time the sun goes down. I had parked my car just outside a small convenience store, planning to grab a drink before heading home. As I walked out of the store with my soda, I saw a man standing by a bench near the entrance. He was pacing back and forth, muttering to himself like he was trying to figure something out. I didn't think much of it at first. People act strange all the time, especially late at night in this part of town. But then he saw me. He stopped pacing and approached me quickly, almost as if he had been waiting for me to leave the store. "Excuse me," he said, his voice shaky. "I'm really sorry to bother you, but I need to make an emergency call. My phone died, and I can't find a charger anywhere. I've been trying to reach my brother. Can I borrow your phone just for a minute? It's really important." I don't know why, but something about his voice seemed genuine. Maybe it was the panic in his eyes or the fact that he was standing outside in the cold, looking helpless. He wasn't dressed in any way that screamed trouble, just a simple jacket, jeans, and sneakers. He didn't look like the kind of person who would want to cause harm, at least not to me. "Sure," I said, taking my phone out of my pocket and handing it to him. "Just make it quick." He thanked me repeatedly, holding my phone like it was a lifeline. I stepped back a little, letting him make the call, though I couldn't hear what he was saying. It seemed like he was talking to someone, but his voice was low, almost like he was trying to keep the conversation private. After a minute, he hung up, gave me a brief smile, and handed my phone back. "Thank you so much. I really appreciate it. My brother was out of town and I couldn't get through to anyone else. You really saved me." I nodded, smiling back politely, though part of me was already getting that uncomfortable feeling that maybe I had done something I shouldn't have. Still, I shrugged it off, assuming that he was just a guy in a bad situation. It happens, right? People lose their phones, or their batteries die, and they need help. He turned and walked off into the street, heading in the opposite direction from where I was parked. I stayed for a few more minutes, sipping my drink and trying to shake the weird feeling in my chest. Something felt off about the whole situation, but I couldn't place my finger on it. I shook my head and decided it was nothing, probably just my imagination running wild. When I got home, I tossed my phone onto the kitchen counter, too tired to even think about it anymore. I had been working all day, and I just wanted to relax. But later that night, as I was getting ready for bed, I noticed something strange. My phone had been acting funny. It was barely noticeable at first. The screen took a few seconds longer than usual to unlock. My apps were sluggish, and there was this odd little vibration when I tapped on certain things. I didn't think much of it. Sometimes phones glitch for no reason, right? But then I saw something that made my stomach drop. A notification popped up from a tracking app one didn't recognize. It wasn't a normal notification. It looked like a map with a dot on it, moving around. I instantly felt my blood run cold. My first thought was that it was some kind of spam or adware that had somehow gotten through my phone's security. I didn't think too much about it at first. I quickly checked my apps, trying to figure out what it was. There was no sign of any app that I had downloaded that could be responsible. Then it hit me, something from earlier in the evening. I'd given my phone to that guy. My stomach turned as I realized what had probably happened. I quickly pulled up my phone's app manager and started searching through the apps, digging deep into system files. And there it was. One small, inconspicuous app labeled location, with no icon, just a name that seemed totally normal. I tapped it, and that's when I saw it, the tracking software. It wasn't just tracking my location, it was keeping tabs on everywhere I'd been over the last few days. I hadn't noticed anything odd before, no unusual apps, no strange permissions, but it was all there now, hidden in the background. I could feel my heart pounding in my chest. How long had this been running? Had it been on my phone the entire time? I couldn't believe it. It wasn't a simple bug or a glitch, it was a deliberate invasion. I quickly disabled the app, but my mind kept racing. Who was this guy? How did he know about tracking software? And, most importantly, how many other people had he done this to? I immediately called my phone provider, explained the situation, and they advised me to reset my phone to factory settings. It was the only way to ensure that the tracking software was completely removed. I did it immediately, wiping everything from my phone. The relief I felt when the tracking notification disappeared was palpable, but there was still a gnawing fear in the pit of my stomach. What if that wasn't the only thing he'd done? What if there were other things hidden on my phone, things that I couldn't see? It was a huge violation of trust, and I had no idea who to turn to. I told a few friends the next day. Some were understanding, others thought I was overreacting. But deep down, I knew something had been done to me that wasn't just an accident. That guy had targeted me, and now my privacy, my personal safety, had been compromised. I haven't seen him since that night, but I keep my phone close now, always double-checking permissions and staying aware of any odd behavior. I still feel a sense of unease, even after deleting everything. It's not just the feeling of being watched, it's the knowledge that someone out there has the ability to track you, to know where you are, without you even realizing it. I keep telling myself I'm being paranoid, that I'm just overthinking it. But when I walk around, I sometimes catch myself looking over my shoulder, wondering if he's out there somewhere. I wasn't expecting to find anything out of the ordinary that morning. It was just a simple walk through the park. I like going early, before it gets crowded, when the air is still cool and everything feels calm. It's a good way to clear my head. I'm not the type to run or jog, but I enjoy a good, quiet walk with a coffee in hand. The park was pretty much empty that day, save for a couple of joggers in the distance and a few people walking their dogs. The sun had barely risen above the trees, casting a soft light over the benches and paths. It was peaceful, just the way I liked it. I was heading down my usual route near the lake when I saw it, a backpack sitting on a bench all alone. I've always been the type to look out for lost items, especially in public places. Maybe it's because I know how stressful it can be to lose something important, like a wallet or a phone, and I'd hate for someone to go through that. I walked over to the bench, thinking I'd find something innocuous. Maybe some school books or a jacket someone had forgotten. But when I picked it up, I noticed how heavy it felt. Not just heavy, though it felt odd. There was something about it that made me pause. The straps were perfectly aligned, and it was sitting so neatly on the bench that it didn't look like it had been casually discarded. It almost seemed like someone had placed it there intentionally. I figured I'd check inside, just to make sure it was truly abandoned, and there wasn't anything personal in it. Maybe there was a wallet or ID so I could contact the owner. The zipper was a little stiff, but it opened easily enough. Inside, I found a few things that seemed normal: a water bottle, a couple of notebooks, some snacks, nothing unusual. But then I saw something that made my stomach twist. There was a small, unmarked envelope at the bottom. It wasn't sealed, just folded over once. I pulled it out cautiously, trying not to get too curious. I didn't want to pry, but I couldn't help but wonder what it was. As I unfolded it, I noticed the handwriting on the front, neat, almost professional looking. It didn't say anything except for a name, Jonas. The name didn't mean anything to me, but still, something about it made me feel uncomfortable. I'm not sure why, but I quickly folded the envelope back up and placed it back into the bag. The rest of the items seemed entirely ordinary, so I decided to take the backpack to the lost and found, as I usually do when I find something like this. I stood up to leave the bench, holding the bag by the straps, when I heard a voice behind me. "Hey! That's mine. What are you doing with my bag?" I turned around, startled. A man, probably in his mid-30s, was standing a few feet away. He was tall, wearing a black hoodie and sweatpants. His expression was tense, and he was staring right at me, his eyes hard. I froze for a moment, confused. "Ah, sorry, I didn't mean to take it," I said, holding up the bag. "I found it here on the bench." I was going to take it to the lost and found. The man took a step forward, his eyes narrowing. "No, that's my bag. You're stealing it. Give it back." I blinked, thrown off by his response. "What?" "No, I'm not stealing it." "Give it back," he interrupted, his voice louder now, drawing the attention of the few people walking by. "That's my property. You can't just take things that aren't yours." I tried to stay calm, still holding the bag out in front of me. "Look, I wasn't trying to steal it. I found it on the bench, and I was just going to turn it in." The man took another step forward, closing the distance between us. His face had become flushed, his eyes wild. "No, it's mine. You don't know what's in there, but it's mine. You have to return it." I wasn't sure what to do. Part of me was starting to feel a little intimidated, but at the same time, something didn't sit right with me about his behavior. Why was he acting so frantic? People don't usually get that worked up over a bag, especially if they've left it unattended. But I wasn't going to give him the bag without some explanation. "I'm not giving it to you without knowing why you're so upset," I said, my voice steady, but a little more firm now. "If it's really yours, you can take it to the lost and found and prove it." His face twisted into a scowl. "I'm not going to the lost and found. I want it now. Just give it to me." The way he was acting made me uneasy. It was as though he wasn't just upset about losing a bag, there was something deeper behind it. Something more desperate. I tried to step back, thinking maybe I could walk away without any more confrontation, but as soon as I moved, the man took a step toward me again. "Hey," he shouted. "Give it to me. You have no right to take it." His voice had started to raise to an almost shouting level, and I could see some of the people walking past us now turning to look. I didn't want a scene, and I didn't want to provoke him further, but I also didn't want to hand the bag over to someone who might not be the rightful owner. I glanced around, hoping someone might step in, but the few people nearby were just standing there, watching. "I'm just going to take it to the lost and found," I said, my voice barely a whisper, but I wasn't sure if I was trying to convince him or myself. The man's expression twisted with fury, and for a moment, I thought he might lunge at me. Instead, he stepped back, taking a deep breath like he was trying to control his anger. "You don't know what you're messing with," he said, almost to himself. "You have no idea who you're dealing with." I felt a chill crawl down my spine. What did that even mean? Was this just some crazy guy, or was there something more sinister going on? My heart was racing now, and I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off about the whole situation. He stepped back again, eyes never leaving me, and then he said something that sent a shiver through me. "You don't understand. You have to return what's mine." And with that, he turned and walked away, disappearing into the park. I stood there for a long time, unsure of what had just happened. I thought about following him, reporting him, or maybe just finding a police officer. But the more I thought about it, the more I realized that I had no solid proof he was even the rightful owner of the bag. I didn't know if it was his or not. And I couldn't shake the feeling that if I had handed it over to him, something worse might have happened. I decided not to take any chances. Instead of going straight to the lost and found, I left the park and went to a nearby cafe to sit for a while, trying to calm down. I left the backpack in the back seat of my car, unsure of what to do next. I never went back to that park. I never saw that man again, but every time I pass that bench, I can't shake the feeling that I missed something important. And part of me wonders what was in that bag. What did he want so badly that he was willing to make such a scene? I can't help but think it was something more than just a simple backpack. I thought it was just another job opportunity, the kind of thing I needed after being out of work for a few months. I'd been scrolling through job postings every morning for weeks, trying to find something that paid well enough, something that didn't feel like it was just wasting my time. Then, last Tuesday, I saw it. The email popped up in my inbox, a job interview invitation for a position I thought was perfect for me, office administrator for a small company that sounded very promising. The email was clean, professional, and the company seemed to have solid reviews. I wasn't suspicious at all. The interview was set for 2 p.m. that day. The building was only a short drive from my apartment, so I planned to leave a little early. I didn't want to risk being late, especially for a job like this. I dressed in my usual business attire, trying to look as professional as possible, and left the house with plenty of time to spare. I arrived at the office building at about 1:45 p.m. It wasn't a huge skyscraper or anything, but it was a decent-sized building, a little older but well-maintained. The front door was locked, but I figured that was normal since it wasn't quite the top of the hour yet. I stood there, waiting for a minute, when a man walked up to the door, pushing it open with a key. He didn't seem to notice me standing there until the door was open. "Oh, you must be the candidate for the interview," he said, his voice warm and inviting. He was in his mid-40s, dressed in a clean white shirt and dark trousers, wearing glasses. He had a friendly smile. I nodded, smiling back. "Yes, that's me." He stepped aside and gestured for me to come in. "Please, come right in," he said. I followed him into the building, the door clicking shut behind me. The entrance area was quiet, with white walls and a small reception desk that was empty. There wasn't anyone sitting at the desk, and the hallway seemed to stretch off into the distance. The man led me down the hallway, his footsteps echoing off the walls. "Do you want to tell me a little about your experience before we get started?" he asked, turning his head slightly to look at me. I nodded and began telling him about my previous roles, the work I'd done in various office settings. I was trying to keep calm and professional, but I couldn't help noticing how eerily quiet the building was. There were no other voices, no sounds of phones ringing or people typing away on keyboards. As we walked down the hallway, I began to realize that the office space was much smaller than I expected. There were only a few doors along the hallway, none of them had names or titles on them. I thought it was strange that the company had such a small space, especially considering the job description seemed to imply they were more established. But maybe I was overthinking it. The man led me to a small office at the end of the hallway. He opened the door and gestured for me to sit in one of the chairs. "Please, make yourself comfortable," he said. The office was simple, with a desk and a few chairs scattered around. The blinds were drawn on the windows, leaving the room dim. I could only see a faint strip of light coming through the edges of the blinds. The whole place had a kind of sterile feeling to it, and I started to feel an odd unease in the pit of my stomach. I sat down as he closed the door behind him. He went around the desk and sat in the chair opposite me, pulling out a file folder from the desk drawer. He didn't immediately say anything, just started flipping through the papers inside. I cleared my throat and tried to break the silence. "So, what is the next step in the interview process?" He looked up at me with that same warm smile. "We'll just have a quick conversation," he said. "I just want to get a sense of who you are, your background, and how you fit into the position. There's not much to it, really." I nodded, trying to ignore the discomfort creeping up my spine. As he started asking me more questions, I began to notice that his focus seemed oddly intense. It wasn't just about my experience anymore. It was as if he was digging deeper into my personal life, asking about my family, my daily routines, my hobbies. At first, I thought it was just a natural part of getting to know someone during an interview, but then it started to feel invasive. I tried to keep my answers brief, but the questions kept coming. "So, what's your living situation like?" he asked, leaning slightly forward. "Are you living alone? Are you planning to relocate anytime soon?" I paused for a moment, feeling a twinge of unease. "I'm living alone for now," I said cautiously, not sure where he was going with this. "But no plans to relocate." He nodded, scribbling something down in the folder. "And what time do you usually go to bed? Do you have any late-night commitments?" he asked. I didn't answer right away. I wasn't sure why, but this line of questioning felt strange. It wasn't the sort of thing I'd expect an interviewer to ask. But I brushed it off, thinking maybe it was part of some psychological test or something. "I usually go to bed around 11, I said, not wanting to dwell on the weirdness of it all. He smiled again, but there was something different about it this time. His eyes didn't look warm anymore. They looked more like he was calculating something. "Good," he said, still scribbling in the folder. "Now, I'm just going to lock the door behind us. I'll be right back." I watched as he stood up and walked over to the door. I assumed he was just stepping out for a moment, maybe to grab a drink or speak to someone outside. But instead of opening the door, I saw him turn the lock, and the sharp click of the door locking echoed through the room. I froze, unsure of what to do. My pulse quickened. "What are you doing?" I asked, my voice tight with sudden anxiety. The man turned slowly, still smiling, but this time there was something unsettling about the smile. "I just don't want to be disturbed," he said, his tone too calm, too casual. "It's important that we finish this interview without interruptions." I stood up quickly, my heart pounding in my chest. "I think I need to leave," I said, trying to stay composed, but my voice shook. He didn't respond immediately, just walked back toward the desk, his movements slow and deliberate. I could feel my anxiety rising with every passing second. Something was wrong. This wasn't an interview anymore. This was something else entirely. I reached for the door handle, but it wouldn't budge. I tried again, panicking now, but the door was firmly locked. The man walked toward me, still smiling. "Don't worry," he said, his voice too calm, too reassuring. "We're just getting started." That's when I realized I had made a huge mistake by coming here. I didn't know what he wanted, but I was certain I wasn't safe anymore. I looked around the room, my mind racing for a way out. There had to be a way out. It started a week ago, but I still can't get the images out of my head. I don't know if I'll ever be able to forget what happened. I had surgery. Nothing too serious, just a routine procedure, but it left me needing a few days of recovery at the hospital. My doctor assured me that everything would be fine. It wasn't a big hospital, not the kind you see in the city, but one of those smaller ones that's out in the country, more isolated. The kind of place where everyone knows each other, and the staff are familiar with every patient that walks through the door. I wasn't worried. After the surgery, I was groggy, mostly asleep, and I didn't notice much. But I woke up in the middle of the night, disoriented, and I realized something was off. My room felt different. The lights were dim, but the place felt too quiet. Too still. At first, I thought maybe it was just the after effects of the anesthesia, but as I looked around, I realized something wasn't right. There was someone sitting at the far side of the room, near the window, just staring at me. I couldn't make out the details, but I could see the shape of a person hunched over, their face in shadows. My heart raced, and I tried to sit up, but the pain from the surgery shot through my chest. "Hello?" I whispered, my voice hoarse. I wasn't sure what to expect, but the person didn't answer. They just sat there, motionless. My throat was dry, and I wanted to scream, but I didn't. I thought maybe it was a nurse or someone from the hospital just checking in on me, but the silence was unnerving. After a few moments, the person shifted slightly. I could make out the faint outline of handcuffs on their wrists. That's when the panic set in. I was alone with someone who had been restrained. That's when I heard a faint shuffle and the jangle of metal. I tried to call out again, but nothing came out. My throat was too dry. I could barely move, still recovering from the surgery, and now my mind was racing with questions. Why was someone in handcuffs here? Why hadn't anyone told me about this? The person moved slightly. I could feel my heart in my throat as I watched the shadows. I tried to stay calm, but I could hear the faint clink of metal every time they shifted in their seat. I needed help. I needed to get out of there. My instinct was to press the nurse call button, but when I reached for it, I realized the cord had been cut. That's when I started to panic. I tried to look around the room, my vision still blurry from the meds, but the silence was suffocating. Then, out of the corner of my eye, I saw it. The door to my room, which was supposed to be locked for safety, was ajar. And that's when I heard it. The faint sound of footsteps approaching. My blood ran cold. I tried to force myself to stand, but the pain from my stitches was too much. Every movement felt like my body was on fire. I froze, every muscle tense, straining to hear any sound that would indicate help was near. The footsteps stopped. The person at the window was still, but I could sense their attention shifting. I could feel the weight of their eyes on me, but I couldn't make myself look directly at them. My breath was shallow now, and I realized the situation was far worse than I had initially thought. Whoever this was, this person locked up and sitting in my hospital room wasn't supposed to be here. That's when I heard the voice, low and gravelly. It was like a whisper, but it carried enough to send a chill down my spine. "Stay quiet," the voice said, barely above a whisper. I froze. My instinct screamed at me to call for help, but I knew it would be useless. There was no one coming. I was alone. I don't know how long we stayed like that. The silence was unbearable. My only focus was the handcuffs, the metallic sound, the person in my room. My thoughts raced through possibilities, none of them good. Then, it happened. The lights went out. The whole hospital went dark, and all I could hear was the sound of my heartbeat and the distant hum of the emergency generator kicking in. The power failure was brief, just long enough to leave the entire building in pitch black darkness. It was enough to make everything seem even more sinister. I could hear the person standing up now, moving in the dark, footsteps coming closer. I felt my entire body freeze in terror. Then the unmistakable sound of metal scraping against the floor reached my ears, and the person moved closer. "Stay down," they whispered again, this time with a little more force. I barely had time to react before the door to my room slammed open with a force that rattled the walls. Someone entered, loud, deliberate footsteps. It was one of the police officers, and I couldn't tell whether they were here to help or if they were part of what was going on. "Is everything okay in here?" the officer asked, voice heavy with suspicion, but he didn't come into the room. The person in the shadows, the one in handcuffs, spoke again, their voice shaking slightly now. "Get me out of here," they demanded, not in a whisper this time. Their voice was more commanding, urgent. "I can't do that," the officer responded, his tone firm but unsure. "You're not going anywhere." For a moment, the room was still. Then, without warning, the figure lunged forward. There was a scuffle. The sound of metal clanging, followed by a scream. I couldn't see anything. I was paralyzed, trapped in the bed, too terrified to move. I heard the officer shout, then a gunshot. The crack of it echoed through the room, but the silence that followed was worse than anything. I could feel something was wrong, but I couldn't see anything. My mind couldn't comprehend what had just happened. The officer came in finally, his flashlight cutting through the darkness, and I saw him kneeling beside me. He was saying something, but I couldn't hear it over the ringing in my ears. I was moved quickly after that, taken to another room. The doctor came in to check on me, but I was still too disoriented to make sense of it all. Later, I learned the full story. The person who had been in my room wasn't just any criminal. They were violent, dangerous, and had been caught on charges I didn't want to know. The officer had been keeping them in my room by mistake. They'd been placed in the wrong ward. The power outage had been the perfect opportunity for them to escape, except they didn't expect the officer to intervene. But by then, it was too late for me. I couldn't erase the memory of that night, the feeling of being trapped in a room with someone who should never have been there. It took weeks for me to feel safe again. And I still don't trust hospitals. The whole thing still feels unreal. But it happened, and I don't think I'll ever be able to forget it. It started as a normal Thursday. The kind of day you don't expect anything unusual to happen, so you go about your business without thinking twice. I had just finished lunch, and I was scrolling through some emails when I heard a knock at the door. It was strange because I wasn't expecting anything, and no one ever visits me during the middle of the day. But I figured it was just another package. I'd been ordering a lot of things lately. When I opened the door, there was no one there, but a large, nondescript cardboard box was sitting on the step. It wasn't even taped shut properly, just sort of hastily sealed with a few strips of packing tape. There was no return address, just a shipping label with my name and address typed in black ink. I figured it was an error, maybe a delivery mix-up. After all, I had made some online purchases recently, so it didn't seem out of place to get an unexpected package. I brought it inside, curiosity getting the better of me. At first, I thought I'd just call the delivery service and have them pick it up, but then I realized I'd better check it myself to avoid making a bigger fuss. As I peeled away the tape, I noticed the box felt unusually heavy for its size. I opened the flaps, and at first, all I saw were layers of bubble wrap and packing peanuts. But as I dug deeper, I froze. Inside the box were several neatly packaged plastic bags, each filled with something I couldn't immediately identify. The first bag contained small vials, some of which looked like they could hold a liquid, others like powder. The second contained what appeared to be stacks of cash, bound tightly with rubber bands. And the third, that was when I realized something was seriously wrong. It was a small, sealed box, labeled in a foreign language, with an ominous, almost clinical-looking symbol on it. I had no idea what any of it was, but my mind immediately began racing, trying to make sense of it. I knew right away that these were not things I should have had in my possession. I was in a complete panic at this point. I thought about calling the police, but I hesitated. What if it was just a mistake? What if it was meant for someone else and I got tangled in something I didn't even understand? I knew I couldn't just throw the package away or ignore it. This wasn't something you could easily explain away, and the weight of it all began to settle in. I paced around my apartment, trying to calm myself down. The more I thought about it, the worse it seemed. I looked out the window and realized something else. There was a car parked across the street. It had been there for a while, and I don't remember seeing it when I left for lunch. At first, I told myself it was probably just a neighbor's car, but then I noticed something strange. The person sitting inside wasn't moving. I stared at the car for a long time, trying to make out any details through the blinds. There was a man inside, but he wasn't looking at anything. He was just sitting there, still, like he was waiting. It made my skin crawl. I'd never seen him before, and I didn't recognize the car either. Could this be a coincidence? I went back to the package, still unsure what to do. I carefully closed it up, trying not to disturb anything too much. My mind raced with the possibilities. If this was a mistake, why wasn't anyone trying to retrieve it? The more I thought about it, the more I started to suspect this wasn't an error at all. Someone had deliberately sent this package to my home. I pulled my phone out and checked the delivery tracking. Nothing. The status said it was delivered, but there was no sign of a shipment order from my account. It didn't add up. I tried calling the courier service, but they were closed for the day. That left me with no answers. The car across the street was still there, parked in the same spot, with the man still sitting inside, doing nothing. At this point, I felt completely exposed. I wasn't sure what was going on, but I felt the weight of the situation pressing down on me. I decided to take a chance and called a friend. I told him about the package, about the man in the car, and how everything felt off. He didn't have much advice, but he did tell me to stay inside and keep the doors locked. As I was talking to him, I saw something else, a shadow darting quickly past the window. I froze. Someone was walking across the yard toward my front door. It wasn't the man in the car. This was someone else. I hung up the phone and moved quietly to the window, peeking through the blinds just enough to see outside. The person walking toward my house didn't seem to notice I was watching. I couldn't make out any details, but their gait was hurried. My breath caught in my throat when they reached the porch. They stopped right at the door, almost like they knew exactly where they were going. I didn't know what to do. The last thing I wanted to do was open the door and face whatever was happening. I could hear my heart pounding in my ears as I slowly backed away from the window. My mind was racing, trying to piece everything together. The strange package, the man in the car, and now this person at my door. I couldn't tell if I was imagining things, but it felt like I was being watched. Like the whole situation was a setup. I locked all the windows and doors, double-checked everything, and grabbed my phone, ready to call the police if necessary. I looked out the window again, and the man in the car was gone. But I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. The person who had been walking across the yard, they were gone too, just vanished into thin air. Had they come for the package? Were they watching to make sure I didn't call the authorities? I had no idea, but I knew that whatever was going on, it wasn't normal. The next few hours felt like an eternity. I kept my phone close and stayed away from the windows, too scared to check if anyone was outside. I didn't sleep that night. I stayed awake, wondering if someone would come back for the package. The next morning, I contacted the police, and they came by to take the package for evidence. They didn't give me many details, but assured me they would look into it. They seemed to believe it was a mix-up, though the fact that it had no tracking or return address made them suspicious. It's been weeks since then, and I still don't feel safe. I moved my furniture around, changed my daily routine, and made sure I'm always paying attention to what's going on outside. I can't shake the feeling that someone is still watching me, waiting for me to slip up. And every time I hear a knock at the door, or see a car stop across the street, I get that same sinking feeling in my stomach. I've never felt more paranoid in my life. The whole thing doesn't add up, and I'm starting to think the package wasn't a mistake after all. Whoever sent it, whoever's been watching, they haven't left. And I don't know when they'll be back. It was supposed to be a simple overnight hike. I'd been planning it for weeks, carefully picking a trail I knew wasn't too crowded but still had enough markers that I wouldn't get lost. I packed everything I needed: food, gear, and my water reservoir, which I triple-checked before leaving. The hike out to the campsite was perfect. The weather was clear, the air crisp. I didn't see another person the whole way, and for once, I didn't mind. It was peaceful, just me and the sounds of the forest. I reached the spot I'd picked out a little before sunset, a flat clearing near a small stream. I set up my tent, cooked a quick meal, and sat outside watching the stars come out. When the temperature dropped, I crawled into my sleeping bag and fell asleep almost immediately. The next morning, I felt ready to tackle the hike back. I packed up camp quickly, not wanting to waste daylight. I took a sip from my water reservoir before zipping it into my pack, and everything seemed fine. The stream nearby was clear, so I refilled my backup bottle just in case and started on the trail. It wasn't until late morning that I noticed something was wrong. I stopped to take a drink and realized the water tasted off. At first, I thought maybe it was the plastic from the reservoir, but I'd never had that problem before. I took another sip, and this time, the taste was stronger, almost metallic. I stopped walking and took the reservoir out of my pack to inspect it. The water looked fine, but the smell hit me as soon as I opened it. It was chemical, sharp, like something you'd use to clean a bathroom. I dumped it out immediately, my heart pounding. I didn't understand. I'd filled the reservoir that morning from the same stream I'd used the night before, and I'd used a filter both times. I checked my backup bottle, and that's when the panic really set in. The water in the bottle had the same smell. I didn't know what to do. I was miles from the trailhead, and the sun was getting higher. It was hot, and I'd already been hiking for a couple of hours. I'd planned my water carefully, and now I didn't have any that was safe to drink. I thought about turning back to the stream near the campsite, but the idea made me nervous. What if there was something in the water there? Or worse, what if someone was there? The thought came out of nowhere, but once I had it, I couldn't shake it. I tried to push it away. Who would do something like this? But the reservoir and bottle were fine the night before. I was sure of it. I decided to keep going. The trail was supposed to follow another stream a few miles ahead, and I figured I'd try again there. The hike felt different now. Every sound in the forest made me jump. I kept looking over my shoulder, half expecting to see someone behind me, but the trail stayed empty. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. By the time I reached the second stream, I was sweating and lightheaded. I crouched by the water, my filter in hand, but I hesitated. The water looked fine, but what if it wasn't? What if the problem wasn't the water at all? I forced myself to filter some and took a small sip. It tasted normal, but I couldn't bring myself to drink more. The memory of the smell from my reservoir was still too strong. I filled my backup bottle and packed it away, deciding I'd only drink if I absolutely had to. I kept walking, trying to focus on the trail ahead and not the growing sense of dread in my chest. The trail started to climb, winding up a steep hill. I was struggling by then, my legs shaking from dehydration. I had to stop every few minutes to catch my breath. That's when I saw it. At the top of the hill, where the trail curved, there was a pile of rocks stacked in a way that wasn't natural. It was small, maybe a foot tall, but it stood out. I froze, staring at it. I didn't remember seeing it on the way in. Slowly, I walked closer. My mouth was dry, and not just from the lack of water. When I reached the rocks, I saw something sticking out from between them. A piece of paper, folded and tucked into the pile. I hesitated, my heart pounding, before pulling it out. The paper was damp and smudged, but I could still read the writing. Not safe. That was all it said. I dropped the paper and stumbled back, looking around wildly. The forest was silent, the trees swaying gently in the breeze. I felt exposed, like whoever had left the note was watching me. My mind raced. Did they mean the water wasn't safe? Or was it something else? I didn't wait to find out. I started moving, faster now, even though my legs felt like they were going to give out. I don't know how long I walked like that, my head spinning and my throat burning. At some point, I thought I heard footsteps behind me, but when I turned around, there was no one there. By the time I reached the trailhead, I was barely holding it together. My car was the only one in the parking lot, just as it had been when I'd arrived. I climbed in and locked the doors, my hand shaking so badly I could barely get the key into the ignition. As I drove away, I couldn't stop thinking about the note or the water. I still don't know what happened out there, or who tampered with my supplies. All I know is that I've never felt safe in the woods since. I was in a rush that day. I had just finished an important meeting for work, and I needed to get to my next appointment on time. I didn't want to waste time waiting for a taxi, so I opened up the carpool app on my phone and booked a ride. It was one of those things I'd used a few times before, but I had never really thought much about it until that day. The driver's name popped up on my phone, Derek. His profile picture looked like it was taken in a park, with the sun shining behind him. It looked normal enough. I confirmed the ride, and within minutes, I saw his car pulling up outside the building. When I opened the door and got in, everything seemed fine. He greeted me with a smile, and I nodded back, not thinking too much of it. The car was clean, a little older than I expected, but still fine for a quick ride. I didn't really pay attention to the details of his appearance at first. I just wanted to get to my destination and get on with my day. I gave him the address for my next meeting, and we pulled away from the curb. We started out like any normal ride. The usual small talk. He asked how my day was going, if I had any plans for the weekend. I didn't mind, though. I wasn't in the mood to talk much, but I gave him short answers. The ride felt uneventful. But after a few minutes, I noticed something. I didn't recognize the streets he was taking. At first, I thought maybe he was just taking a different route, or maybe there was traffic on the usual road. But the streets were getting quieter. The buildings were looking more rundown. We were moving further away from the busy part of the city where my meeting was supposed to be. "Excuse me, I think you've missed my stop," I said, trying to stay calm, my voice barely above a whisper. He didn't respond immediately, just kept driving. The silence between us grew thick. I tried again, a little firmer this time. "I need to go to address." "You're going the wrong way." He glanced at me in the rearview mirror, his eyes catching mine. There was something about the way he looked at me that made my stomach twist. It wasn't that he seemed angry or even annoyed. It was more like he wasn't really hearing me. His eyes had an almost vacant look to them. I know, he said, his voice calm, too calm. "I'll get you there. Just a little detour first, don't worry." A detour? That didn't make sense. I had used the app enough times to know that the usual route was straightforward, nothing complicated, no detours. My office wasn't far from where I had been dropped off, and the destination was right in the middle of a busy part of the city. "Is everything okay?" I asked, my voice now a little tighter. He didn't respond right away. Instead, he just kept driving, taking a sharp turn onto a street I didn't recognize. I could feel my nerves start to tighten. Something was wrong. My instinct told me that I needed to get out of the car. I reached for my phone in my bag, ready to text my colleague or call for help, but I didn't want to make any sudden movements. I didn't know this man. I didn't know what he might do. "Could you stop the car, please?" I asked, my voice much more forceful now. "I'm not comfortable with this." He finally spoke again, but his tone had changed. It wasn't casual anymore. It was almost cold, like he wasn't speaking to a passenger anymore. "I told you, don't worry. We're almost there." That's when I noticed it. The neighborhood was getting worse. The buildings were crumbling, the streets were barely lit, and there weren't many cars on the road. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up. This was not the area I needed to be in. I wasn't familiar with this place, but I could tell it was a bad part of town. The kind of place you didn't go alone, especially not when the sun was setting. I started to panic, but I didn't want to let him know. I tried to keep my voice steady when I spoke again. "I really need you to stop, right here. Please." He looked at me through the rearview mirror again, and this time, there was something off about his smile. It wasn't a friendly smile anymore. It was more like a knowing grin, the kind that made my blood run cold. "Just relax," he said, his voice low. "You're going to be fine." I could feel my heart pounding in my chest, my hands sweating as I gripped my phone tighter. The fear was starting to wash over me now, and I didn't know how to shake it. I had been in uncomfortable situations before, but this was different. This wasn't a normal ride. Suddenly, he turned the car down an alleyway. It was so dark I could barely see anything outside. I was starting to feel trapped, completely at his mercy. I had no idea where we were going, and I had no idea how to get out of this situation. I tried to reach for the door handle, but the locks clicked in place. "Stop the car," I said, my voice cracking. "Please. I need to get out. Now." But he just kept driving. I could hear him humming to himself, the sound making the entire situation feel even more surreal. I had to do something. I couldn't just sit there and wait for whatever he was planning. I knew I had to act fast. In one swift motion, I unlocked the door and flung it open. The car was moving slowly enough that I could jump out without injuring myself. My feet hit the pavement, and I ran without looking back. I didn't care if he followed me. I didn't care if he came after me. All I cared about was getting away from that car, from him. I didn't even stop to check if anyone was around. I just ran. I don't know how far I ran, but eventually I found a busy street. People were walking around, and I could see a store with lights on. I ran into the store, breathless, my heart still pounding in my chest. The store clerk gave me a strange look, but I didn't care. I told them I needed to call the police, and they let me use the phone. When the police arrived, they checked the area for the car. They found it a few blocks down, parked and empty. No sign of the driver. They said they would investigate, but honestly, I was too shaken to think about it much more. I just wanted to get out of that area. I never used the carpool app again after that. I couldn't shake the feeling that I had narrowly escaped something worse. Something I couldn't even put into words. I still don't know what that man's intentions were. But I know one thing for sure, he wasn't planning to take me where I needed to go. And I'm just thankful I got out in time. I don't know what made me go out there that night. I wish I hadn't, but I did. I can still feel the weight of it when I think back. The rain was coming down hard, pounding against the windows like it had something to prove. The wind howled, and I could hear the trees outside creaking and bending with the storm. I was alone at the time, just trying to relax after a long day, curled up on the couch with a book. The only light came from the dim glow of the lamp beside me, and it was quiet, save for the sound of the rain. Then, I heard it. A noise. At first, I thought it was just the storm, maybe the wind making something rattle, but then I heard it again. It was faint, almost muffled, but there was no mistaking it. The sound of something scraping against the shed in my backyard. I froze. My heart skipped a beat, and for a moment, I wondered if I was imagining things. It was late, and I hadn't heard anything earlier. The shed had always been just a place to store old garden tools and things I never used, but in that moment, it seemed so much more ominous. I tried to tell myself it was just a storm, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. The noise came again, a scraping sound, followed by something heavier, like a footstep. It was clear now, someone or something was out there. My first instinct was to grab my phone and call the police, but I didn't. I don't know why, but something made me hesitate. Maybe it was the thought that if I made that call, I'd seem foolish. Who would be outside in this weather? Who would be in my shed? But then the idea settled in my mind. What if someone was breaking in? What if they needed help? The thought of someone being hurt, someone in distress, kept me from just running back into the house. So, against my better judgment, I grabbed a flashlight from the kitchen drawer, wrapped myself in my raincoat, and headed outside. I stepped out into the yard, my boots sinking into the soggy ground. The rain felt cold against my skin, but it didn't matter. My heart was racing in my chest. I turned on the flashlight and shined it toward the shed, my hands shaking. The beam flickered at first, but then it steadied, cutting through the darkness. The shed stood at the far end of the yard, shrouded in shadow. I couldn't see anything unusual, but I knew someone or something was out there. I took a few steps forward, the wet grass slick underfoot. I was just about to reach the door of the shed when I heard the noise again. This time, it was a thud. It made me jump, and my grip on the flashlight tightened. The door to the shed was slightly ajar, not enough for someone to get out, but enough for me to see a sliver of movement inside. I hesitated. I almost turned back, but I couldn't. I had to know what was happening. I pulled the door open, and the hinges squeaked loudly in the still night air. The shed smelled of old wood, damp and musty, and I had to squint in the dim light of my flashlight to make out anything. "Hello?" I called, trying to sound braver than I felt. "Is someone in here?" There was a moment of silence. The only sound was the rain tapping against the roof, but then, just as I thought maybe I was imagining things, I heard it. A soft, strained voice. It came from the far corner of the shed, barely above a whisper. "Help me." I froze. My heart pounded in my chest as the hairs on the back of my neck stood up. The voice was weak, but it was real. I took a cautious step forward, trying to make sense of what I was hearing. There, in the corner, I saw movement. A figure hunched down, its head bent, shoulders shuddering. I couldn't see their face, but I could tell they were sitting on the floor, almost curled up in a ball. "Who are you?" I asked, my voice trembling. "What's going on?" There was a long pause before the figure responded, but when they did, it was in a low, raspy voice that sent a shiver down my spine. "I need to stay here. Please. Don't make me leave." I stood there, staring at the shape in the corner, trying to make sense of what was going on. I had so many questions, but I didn't know how to ask them. Who was this person? How had they gotten in? Why were they hiding in my shed in the middle of a storm? "What do you mean? What are you doing here?" I said, my voice shaking with a mix of fear and confusion. They didn't answer right away. Instead, they shifted in place, and I heard the scrape of metal on the floor. My flashlight flickered again, and I realized they were holding something in their hand, something long and metallic. A knife, maybe? The fear that had been building inside me turned to panic. I should have run, I should have turned and left the shed, but for some reason, I didn't. I just stood there, frozen, watching as the figure straightened up. "You have to help me," they said, their voice now louder, more urgent. "I can't go back. Please. I can't go back." I had no idea who they were or what they were talking about, but I knew I couldn't stay. Something was wrong. It felt wrong. This was no stranger asking for help. This was something else, something darker. I turned to leave, my heart racing in my chest, when the figure suddenly moved toward me. They stumbled, dragging themselves across the floor. I was too slow to react, and before I knew it, they were standing in front of me, blocking the door. "You can't leave. I need you to stay," they said, their voice now frantic, desperate. I didn't have a choice. I was trapped in the small shed, the door behind me blocked. My only option was to get past them. I reached into my pocket, my fingers brushing my phone, but before I could pull it out, the figure lunged. I don't know how I did it, but I pushed them back with all my strength. They stumbled, and for a split second, I thought I might have a chance. Without thinking, I bolted out the door and into the rain. I didn't look back, not once. I didn't stop running until I was inside the house, locking the door behind me. I called the police right away. When they arrived, they found nothing in the shed. No person, no evidence of anyone being there. But they did take a report. They checked the area, but they didn't find anything suspicious. They said I must have imagined it, that the storm was playing tricks on my mind. I haven't been able to shake the feeling, though. Every time it storms, I hear that voice in my head. Please, don't make me leave. It doesn't go away. Whoever that person was, and whatever they wanted, I don't think they were really asking for help. And that thought still haunts me every time the rain starts to fall. I don't even know where to begin. I've been trying to tell myself it was nothing, just some weird misunderstanding, but I can't shake it. Not after what happened. It started out so normal. We were camping, just the two of us, my girlfriend, Emma, and me. We had picked out a spot deep in the woods, far away from the crowds. We wanted peace, quiet, and the chance to disconnect from everything for a few days. The first day went well. We set up our tent by a small creek, started a fire, and just relaxed. It was a beautiful spot, nothing out of the ordinary. No strange feelings, no weird vibes. Just the two of us talking and laughing, enjoying the evening. It wasn't until the second night that things got strange. It started with them. A group of campers. We hadn't seen them before, but around dusk, they appeared by the fire. They seemed friendly enough, two guys and a woman walking along the trail not far from our site. At first, we barely noticed them, but one of them called out, asking if we wanted to join them for a drink. We had nothing planned for the evening, so we figured, why not? We walked over to their camp, and they were sitting around a fire, the flames casting long shadows in the trees. They had a couple of beers, a bottle of whiskey, and a few snacks. It seemed normal enough. We introduced ourselves, and they were nice. Not overly friendly, but polite. We all started talking, mostly about where we were from and how we ended up here. I'll admit, the conversation was a little awkward at first, but after a few drinks, it loosened up. It was just casual chatter at first, nothing strange. They told us they had been camping in the area for a while, moving from place to place, exploring different parts of the woods. They said they liked the solitude, and I could see that. It wasn't a surprise that they'd come up here to get away from it all. The woman, her name was Claire, was nice enough. But there was something about her smile that felt a little too sharp, a little too knowing. I couldn't explain it. Maybe it was nothing, but I kept getting this feeling that she was watching me just a bit too closely. Every time I glance over at her, she'd be looking right at me, and when our eyes met, she'd smile. It didn't feel threatening, not exactly, but there was something unsettling about it. As the night wore on, the mood seemed to shift. It wasn't overt, but it was there. The guys started making more jokes, laughing a bit too loud, and Claire seemed to get quieter, just watching. I remember trying to keep the conversation going, but it felt like I was the only one still trying. Emma had already finished her drink and looked a little tired, like she was ready to head back to our camp. I felt the same, honestly. The night had stretched on longer than we planned. So, we told them we were going to head back. That's when things started to get weird. At first, it was subtle. One of the guys, Dave, I think his name was, stood up and clapped me on the shoulder, laughing. "You guys aren't going anywhere," he said, too loudly. "The night's still young. Come on, stay for a bit." I chuckled awkwardly, not really feeling like staying. "We're pretty tired," I said, trying to keep it light. "Maybe another time." But then Claire spoke. "You don't want to go yet," she said, and her voice had changed. It wasn't threatening, but it had a kind of cold edge to it, like she wasn't asking anymore. "The night's beautiful. You won't find peace like this anywhere else." Just stay a little longer. I felt this sudden pressure, like they were all looking at us, waiting for an answer. Emma looked at me, and I could tell she was uncomfortable too, but she didn't want to make a scene. She nodded, giving a forced smile. Maybe just a little longer, she said. I wasn't sure why, but something about it didn't sit right. The way they were staring at us made me feel like we didn't really have a choice. I tried to shake it off, but I could feel the tension building. It was like they were waiting for us to stay, to make us stay. I didn't want to be rude, but I knew we needed to get back. Emma had already started to gather her things. I stood up, ready to go, but Dave was standing just a little too close, blocking the path. You don't need to go, he said, and his voice was quieter now, almost too calm. We've got a few more drinks. Just relax. I felt the hair on the back of my neck stand up. There was something in his eyes, something that wasn't right. I tried to step around him, but he didn't move. It was like he was deliberately keeping me there, like they were all trying to keep us from leaving. We really have to go, I said, my voice a little more firm now. We've got stuff to do tomorrow. Claire stood up and took a step closer. You'll be fine, she said, her smile not reaching her eyes. It's not safe to walk back through the woods at night. Stay here. We'll keep you safe. It wasn't the words themselves, it was the way she said it, like there was no other option. I felt trapped, like if I didn't go along with it, something worse might happen. I tried to stay calm, but it was getting harder to hide how uneasy I felt. I looked over at Emma, who seemed equally uncomfortable but didn't say anything. I could see her trying to make up her mind, her eyes darting around the camp, looking for an excuse, an out. Look, we really appreciate it, Emma said, standing up and reaching for my hand. But we're just going to go back. It's getting late. There was a long pause. I could feel their eyes on us, like they were waiting for us to say the right thing. Then, suddenly, Dave stepped aside, giving us just enough space to walk by. But as I passed him, he grabbed my arm, just a quick grip, tight enough to make me stop in my tracks. You know, he said, his voice low, if you really wanted to go, you wouldn't have said that. You'd be gone already. It was like a switch flipped. I didn't think. I just yanked my arm away and pulled Emma with me. We're leaving, I said, my voice shaky but firm. We didn't look back as we hurried down the trail, the light of their campfire flickering behind us, but I could feel them watching us. We didn't say anything to each other until we were safely back at our tent. We just sat there, breathing hard, staring at the darkness outside, not knowing if they were still out there. I still don't know what exactly happened, but I know that they didn't want us to leave. There was something about that whole interaction that felt wrong, like they were pushing us to stay for some reason. I haven't camped since then, and I don't know if I ever will again. I don't think I could handle it. Every time I close my eyes, I remember the way they looked at us, those smiles that never reached their eyes, and I can't shake the feeling that they weren't just trying to be friendly. They were trying to keep us there, and for what? I don't think I'll ever know. It happened a few months ago, but I still can't shake the feeling of what happened that night. I've told a few people about it, but I don't think anyone really gets how scary it was. I still don't fully understand how I ended up in that situation. It all started when I finished my work late one evening. I'm in marketing, and sometimes I'm stuck in the office for hours after everyone else leaves. It was around 11 p.m., and I just wanted to get home. Normally, I take the subway, but it was a Friday, and the trains always feel a little sketchy that late, so I decided to order a rideshare instead. I opened the app, booked a ride, and went outside to wait. I stood by the curb, scrolling through my phone, not really paying much attention to what was going on around me. I was tired and ready to get home. A few minutes later, I saw the car pull up. The app said the name and the car model, so I walked over to it and opened the door without thinking much about it. The driver, a man, looked a little older than me, maybe in his late 30s or early 40s. He didn't seem unusual. He smiled at me when I got in, which I returned with a tired nod. He didn't say anything at first, so I just buckled my seatbelt and settled in, expecting to hear the usual small talk. But instead, he started driving without asking for confirmation or anything. It wasn't until we had driven for a few minutes that I noticed something was off. The route didn't feel familiar. I live in a part of the city that's pretty straightforward to get to from downtown, but we seemed to be heading in the opposite direction. I thought maybe he was taking an alternate route or something, but the streets were getting emptier and less familiar. At first, I didn't say anything. I figured maybe I had just misjudged the route in my tired state. But after about 10 minutes of driving down roads I didn't recognize, I started to get anxious. "Excuse me," I said, my voice a little shaky. "This isn't the way to my place." The driver didn't respond at first, just kept his hands on the wheel, his eyes on the road. I tried again. "Hey, I think you missed my turn. Can you turn around?" That's when he finally spoke. His voice was calm, almost too calm. "No, we're going the right way." I could hear a slight accent in his voice, but it was hard to place. His eyes stayed locked on the road. I felt a knot in my stomach, but I tried to reason with myself. Maybe he was just tired. Maybe he wasn't paying attention. Still, something about the way he said it didn't sit right with me. "Listen, I'm not sure where we're going, but I need to get home," I said, trying to keep my tone polite but firm. "Could you please turn around?" He glanced at me quickly, just a quick flick of his eyes, before looking back at the road. "You don't need to worry about it. I'll take care of it." I couldn't make sense of what was happening. At this point, I started to feel a little panicked. My phone was on the passenger seat beside me, and I considered texting a friend or calling someone. But something in my gut told me not to. I didn't want to give him any reason to get more defensive or angry. We kept driving for what felt like an eternity, passing familiar streetlights that grew more sparse the farther we went. The streets turned darker, and the buildings started to look less like the city and more like empty industrial areas. "Where are we going?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. "This is getting too far out. I need to go home." The driver didn't answer right away. The silence felt suffocating. I thought maybe he hadn't heard me, but then he said something so quiet, I almost didn't catch it. "You'll be fine. Just relax." That's when I started to really panic. The rational part of me wanted to get out, but I didn't know where we were, and I had no idea if I'd even be able to get another ride back. There was nothing around us but dark roads. I tried the door handle, but it was locked. I pulled harder, but it wouldn't budge. "Please let me out," I said, trying to keep my voice calm, even though my heart was racing. "I need to get out of the car now." The driver's grip on the wheel tightened. He didn't look at me, but I could tell he was aware of what I had said. He didn't speak for a long time, and I started to feel like I was suffocating in the small space. "Don't make this difficult," he finally said, his voice colder now. It was like a switch had flipped. "You'll get out when I say so." I couldn't believe it. This wasn't happening. I was in a car with a stranger, headed somewhere I didn't know, with no way to get out. The panic hit me hard, and I started to think about what my options were. I could try to jump out when we stopped, but what if we were somewhere with no one around? What if he came after me? I wasn't strong enough to fight him off. The car slowed down, and I immediately braced myself. My heart felt like it was going to explode. I didn't know if he was going to stop and let me go or if he was going to hurt me. "Stop the car," I demanded, my voice trembling. "Let me out right now." He glanced over at me again, but his expression hadn't changed. It was like he was enjoying my fear. "We're almost there," he said, as if I should just trust him. That's when I couldn't take it anymore. I reached for my phone and started tapping furiously. I knew I had to make a call, even if it was just to alert someone to what was happening. I dialed 911, trying to keep my hand steady as the car turned onto an even darker road. Before I could say anything to the dispatcher, the driver jerked the wheel, making the car swerve slightly. He looked at me then, finally meeting my eyes with a menacing glare. "Hang up," he ordered. "Now." I didn't even think. I hit the red button to end the call. My heart was thundering in my chest. I had no idea if I had just made things worse or saved myself. I took a deep breath and tried to gather myself. I needed to act quickly. "Listen," I said, my voice much more firm now. "I'm going to call the police. You can't do this." He didn't say anything for a moment, then nodded. It was almost like he had made up his mind about something. Finally, he slowed the car and pulled over to the side of the road. "Get out," he said flatly. I didn't ask questions. I opened the door, ran out of the car, and didn't stop until I was far enough away that I could barely see the car's headlights in the distance. My legs felt like jelly, and I was breathing so fast I thought I might pass out. I don't know what would have happened if I hadn't gotten out when I did. I don't know if I'd be here writing this. But I never took a rideshare again after that night, and I don't plan to anytime soon. I went to the grocery store last week, just like I always do. It was a normal day, nothing strange, and I wasn't in a hurry. I parked near the back of the lot because it was crowded, but that didn't bother me. I kind of like the walk, it gives me a moment to breathe before diving into errands. The store was busy, so it took me a little longer than usual to get everything I needed. When I came out, it was starting to get dark. The street lights in the parking lot were on, but they didn't do much. You know that kind of half-light where you can see, but everything feels off? That's how it was. I walked to my car with my bags in hand, not thinking about much, just going through the motions. I noticed a piece of paper stuck under my windshield wiper when I got close. It was one of those bright yellow flyers, the kind you'd expect to see for a car wash or some event. At first, I didn't even think it was odd. People leave stuff like that all the time. I set my bags in the back seat and walked around to grab the flyer. It was stuck under the wiper pretty good, so I had to tug at it. While I was pulling it free, I heard footsteps behind me. Not the kind you hear from far away, but close, too close. I froze for a second, just holding the flyer, and then I turned my head. There was a man standing there, maybe a few feet away. He wasn't holding anything, didn't look like he worked there, and he didn't say anything right away. He just stood there, staring at me. He looked normal enough, jeans, a jacket, dark hair, but something about the way he was standing made me feel like I was in trouble. "Hey," he said finally, his voice calm but low. "You need help with something?" I shook my head. "No, I'm good. Thanks." My voice came out steadier than I felt, but my heart was starting to race. He wasn't smiling or anything, just looking at me like he was waiting for something. I tried to brush it off, turned back to my car, and tossed the flyer into the passenger seat. When I reached for the door handle, I felt his hand grab my arm. Not rough, but firm, like he'd done it before. My first instinct was to pull away, but he was strong. "You're coming with me," he said. Still calm, still too quiet. His tone made my stomach turn. "No, I'm not," I managed to say, yanking harder. I was starting to panic now, and my mind was racing. He didn't look angry or frustrated, just determined. Like he already knew how this was going to go. I didn't even see the van until he started pulling me toward it. It was parked just a few spaces down from my car, one of those older white ones with no windows in the back. The kind you see on TV and know to avoid. My heart was pounding so hard I thought I might faint, but I knew I couldn't let him get me in that van. I screamed. Loud. As loud as I could. I didn't care who heard, I just needed someone to notice. He didn't flinch, just kept pulling me toward the van like my screaming didn't matter. That scared me more than anything because it felt like he'd done this before, like he knew how to handle it. I kicked at him, struggled, tried to twist free, but his grip didn't loosen. He was dragging me now, my feet barely staying under me. The van's side door was open, and I could see the inside, a mess of blankets, rope, and something that looked like duct tape. My mind was screaming at me to fight harder, but I felt so weak, like I wasn't strong enough to stop him. Then I remembered my keys. They were in my pocket, and I reached for them blindly, my fingers shaking so much it took me a second to get them out. I didn't think, just swung my arm and jabbed the sharp end of the key into his hand as hard as I could. He yelled. For the first time, he made a noise, and his grip loosened just enough for me to wrench free. I stumbled backward, almost falling, but I caught myself and ran. I didn't look back, didn't even think. I just ran toward the store, where I could see people coming in and out. I was yelling for help, my voice shaking, and a couple of people turned to look. A man near the entrance came toward me, asking what was wrong. I tried to explain, but I could barely get the words out. He tried to grab me. Over there. By my car. The guy didn't hesitate. He turned and started walking toward the parking lot, yelling something like, "Hey, you stay there." I followed behind him, but when we got back to my car, the man and the van were gone. My groceries were still in the back seat, my keys on the ground where I dropped them. My hands were shaking so bad I could barely pick them up. The guy who'd come to help me stayed with me until the police arrived. I filed a report, told them everything I could remember, but they didn't seem too hopeful. They said they'd checked the security cameras, but I haven't heard anything back yet. I still don't know who he was or why he picked me. All I know is that I've never been so scared in my life, and I'll never park in the back of a lot again. The train car was mostly empty. It was late, past midnight, and I was heading home after a long shift. I liked riding the train at night. It was quiet, and I could finally let my mind wander. There were only a handful of people scattered around the car, all lost in their own worlds. A man with headphones a few rows ahead of me, a woman in a corner seat scrolling through her phone, and another man sitting diagonally across from me with a notebook in his lap. At first, I didn't notice him. I was staring out the window, watching the city lights blur into streaks against the darkness. But something pulled my attention back. the sound of a pen scratching paper. Not unusual, but it felt persistent, deliberate. I glanced over and saw him hunched over the notebook, his hand moving quickly. He was middle-aged, maybe late 40s, with unkempt hair and a faded jacket. Nothing about him stood out, but the way he was focused on that notebook made me curious. I shifted in my seat to get a better look, but he turned the page before I could make out what he was drawing. His eyes flicked up and met mine for a split second before dropping back down to his notebook. Something about that glance made my skin prickle. I told myself it was nothing. People draw in public all the time. Maybe he was an artist, or just someone passing the time. But then I noticed something strange. The angle of his notebook was tilted toward me, like he wanted me to see but also didn't. It felt intentional. I turned my attention back to the window, trying to shake the uneasy feeling creeping over me. But I couldn't ignore it. Out of the corner of my eye, I saw him lift his head again, his gaze settling on me before quickly looking away. When the train slowed at the next station, I made a decision. I grabbed my bag, stood up, and moved to the next car. It wasn't far, just through the connecting doors, but it felt safer putting some distance between us. The new car was even emptier, just one man in a suit sleeping against the window. I took a seat near the middle, where I could see both exits. The train jerked forward, and I leaned back, letting out a breath I didn't realize I'd been holding. But then the door at the end of the car slid open. I looked up and felt my stomach drop. It was him. He didn't hesitate, didn't look around like he was deciding where to sit. He walked straight down the aisle and took a seat a few rows behind me. I could feel his eyes on the back of my head, and my hands clenched around the strap of my bag. I told myself I was imagining things. He could have just been moving cars for the same reason I had. Maybe he wanted more space, or maybe he didn't like the vibe in the last car. But it didn't feel like that. It felt deliberate. The train stopped again, and I decided to test it. I stood up, walked to the door, and stepped into the next car. This one was brighter, with more people. A couple chatting quietly, a man reading a book. I sat near the door, keeping my eyes on the connecting passage. It didn't take long. A minute later, the door slid open, and he stepped through. His eyes scanned the car until they landed on me. He didn't even pretend to look for another seat. He just sat down, closer this time, just 2 rows behind me. My heart was pounding now. I fumbled with my phone, opening a message thread and typing out a quick text to my roommate. There's a guy following me on the train. What do I do? I hit send and waited, staring at the screen like it was a lifeline. She didn't reply right away, and I didn't know if she was asleep or if the message hadn't gone through. The train rattled on, the hum of the tracks filling the silence. I could feel his gaze, even though I didn't turn around to check. The next station came into view, and I made a split-second decision. When the doors opened, I stepped off the train. I didn't plan to leave, I just wanted to see if he would follow. The platform was empty except for a janitor sweeping near the stairs. I stayed close to the edge, watching the doors. For a moment, I thought maybe I was wrong, that he would stay on the train and this would all just be a weird story to laugh about later. But then he stepped off. He stood on the platform, his notebook tucked under his arm. He didn't approach me, didn't say anything, just stood there watching. The doors closed behind him, and the train pulled away, leaving us in silence. I backed toward the stairs, my pulse racing. Can I help you? I finally managed to say, my voice shaking. He tilted his head slightly, like he was considering my question. Then he opened the notebook and turned it toward me. The pages were filled with sketches. My face, my posture, even the way I had been sitting by the window. Page after page, all of me. I felt frozen, my legs refusing to move. "Why are you doing this?" I asked, barely above a whisper. He didn't answer. Instead, he smiled, closed the notebook, and took a step forward. I bolted. My legs finally worked, and I ran up the stairs, taking them two at a time. I didn't look back until I reached the street, my lungs burning and my heart threatening to burst out of my chest. When I turned, he wasn't there. The platform was empty, the station eerily quiet. I didn't stop running until I reached a gas station a few blocks away. The clerk gave me a strange look as I stumbled inside, breathless and disheveled. "Call the police," I said, my voice cracking. "There's a man following me." They came quickly, but by the time they searched the station, he was gone. I filed a report, described him as best as I could, but they didn't seem hopeful. "These things happen," one of the officers said, like it was supposed to make me feel better. I didn't sleep that night, or the night after. It's been weeks, and I can't stop thinking about that notebook. About how many sketches there were. About how long he must have been watching me. I still take the train, but never alone. And I always sit near the conductor's car, where there are people around. But every time I hear the sound of a pen scratching paper, I feel my chest tighten, and I can't help but look over my shoulder. It started as a normal day, just another afternoon spent at the park with my son. It was one of those rare sunny days where the weather was perfect, and the playground was bustling with kids laughing and playing, parents chatting nearby, the usual hum of the neighborhood. I'd brought my son to the swings, letting him play while I sat on the nearby bench, keeping an eye on him like any parent would. He was busy laughing and pumping his legs higher and higher, his little face full of joy. I had been watching him for a few minutes when I noticed a man standing just off to the side, near the edge of the playground. He was just standing there, his hands in his pockets, not moving much. He wasn't doing anything overtly suspicious, but something about him stood out. His posture, the way he was watching the children, he didn't seem like he was there just to enjoy the park. He looked uncomfortable. Not in a way that would immediately raise alarms, but in a way that didn't sit right with me. He wasn't really talking to anyone or doing anything. He was just standing there, eyes constantly scanning over the playground. At first, I tried to shake it off. I was probably overthinking it. You see people standing around all the time at parks. Maybe he was waiting for someone. I glanced around at the other parents, but none of them seemed to notice him. Everyone else seemed too wrapped up in their conversations or their own children to give him a second thought. But the longer I watched him, the more uneasy I became. He never moved from that spot. And every now and then, his eyes would linger just a little too long on the children playing nearby. It wasn't like he was interacting with them directly, but the way he stared at them made me uncomfortable. I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't quite right. I told myself to just focus on my son and ignore the man. But then I saw him glance over at me. It was quick, but our eyes met, and he immediately looked away. That was the moment that made me decide I couldn't just sit there anymore. I stood up, casually walking over to the swings where my son was still happily playing. As I got closer, I saw the man's posture shift. He didn't look like he was just waiting for a friend's child anymore. He looked almost nervous. His eyes flicked back to the playground, scanning the area once more. I don't know what made me do it, but I walked over to him. I felt like I had to say something. It didn't seem right to let him just stand there, watching everyone without explanation. "Hey," I said, my voice steady but firm. "Are you looking for someone?" He didn't seem startled, just turned slightly toward me, still standing with his hands in his pockets. He had an odd look on his face, like he was caught off guard but wasn't sure how to react. "Ah, yeah," he replied after a moment. "I'm waiting for a friend's kid." I raised an eyebrow. "Which one?" He hesitated, and for a brief second, I thought he was going to backpedal. Then he said, "Oh, it's that one." He pointed vaguely toward a group of children who were playing near the jungle gym. But the thing was, I knew all the kids in that area, either by name or by sight. They were all familiar faces from the neighborhood, and none of them seemed to have an unfamiliar adult standing near them. I gave him a skeptical look. "Which one exactly?" I asked again, this time more insistently. He looked uncomfortable but still kept his calm demeanor. "Ah, you know, the one in the red jacket. I'm just waiting for her." I turned my attention to the kids nearby. None of them wore a red jacket, and none of them were being watched by an unfamiliar man. I looked back at him, and that was when the sinking feeling in my stomach grew deeper. I don't know how to explain it, but it felt like he was lying. Or at least, he wasn't being totally upfront. "You're waiting for a child you don't know?" I asked, trying to keep my voice even. "Is this a friend's child?" He gave a small, awkward chuckle, almost as if I'd said something funny. Yeah, just a friend's kid," he replied again, a little too quickly. Now, something felt wrong. It didn't add up. If he was a parent or a relative, he should have known which kid he was waiting for. He should have had a reason to be there, something more concrete than a vague claim of waiting for someone's child. I had lived in this neighborhood for a while, and everyone knew each other. I should have recognized him if he was a parent or a regular at the park. But I didn't. I glanced around again. None of the other parents seemed to be paying attention to us, and my son was still on the swings, happily going back and forth. "I've never seen you around here before," I said, keeping my voice steady. "You sure you're in the right place?" He looked me dead in the eyes then. His expression didn't change, but for a moment, I saw something in his face, something flickered, just beneath the surface. He wasn't just waiting for a child anymore. He was aware of my suspicion. He knew I wasn't buying it. "I'm just waiting for someone," he said again, but his voice had changed. It wasn't as calm now. There was a slight edge to it. "I'm sure you've got kids to watch, right?" I took a step back. My instincts told me to leave it alone, to just walk away, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. I looked at him one more time, and then I did something I should have done from the start. I called over to a friend who was standing nearby, one of the other parents who always came to the park with me. "Hey, do you recognize this guy?" I asked, loud enough so he could hear me. The man's face immediately tightened, his eyes shifting nervously from me to my friend. But my friend looked confused, too. "Nope, never seen him before," she said. That was when the man took a step back, glanced toward the exit of the park, and muttered something under his breath. "I guess I'm at the wrong park," he said, his voice suddenly soft and unconvincing. Without another word, he turned and walked briskly out of the park, keeping his head low. I watched him leave, heart pounding in my chest. My friend and I exchanged uneasy glances, both of us too quiet to speak. I'm not sure why, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. The whole situation felt off. I know it might sound paranoid, but I've never been the type of person to second-guess my gut feeling, especially when it comes to something involving my kid. I told my son it was time to go, and we packed up quickly, walking to the car with a strange sense of urgency. As we left, I glanced back at the park and saw him again, just standing at the edge of the lot, watching us. His figure faded as I drove away, but the feeling stayed with me. I don't know who that man was or what he wanted, but I'm sure of one thing. He wasn't just there to wait for a child. And I will never ignore my instincts again. I still don't know how I made such a stupid mistake. I was tired, distracted, and not paying attention. I don't have a good excuse, but that's what happened. I live in a big apartment complex, the kind where all the hallways look the same, and late at night, it's easy to get turned around. I had been out running errands, came home, and walked up the wrong flight of stairs. I thought I was on my floor, but I wasn't. When I got to what I thought was my apartment, the door was cracked open. Not wide, just enough to make me stop for a second. I remember thinking maybe I hadn't pulled it shut all the way when I left. That happens sometimes, right? I pushed it open and stepped inside without really thinking. The place was dark except for a faint glow from the living room. I could see the TV was on but muted, playing one of those news channels. The layout was the same as mine, living room straight ahead, kitchen to the left, but something felt off. It smelled different, for one thing. Not bad, just not familiar. I called out, "Hello?" My voice sounded strange in the quiet, like it didn't belong there. No answer. I figured maybe my roommate had left the TV on and gone to bed. That's when I started to notice little details. The furniture wasn't arranged like mine. There was a coat on the back of the couch I didn't recognize. A pair of boots by the door, not mine, not my roommate's. I froze. This wasn't my apartment. My stomach dropped, and I felt this wave of embarrassment hit me. I thought, oh God, I walked into someone else's place. I turned around, ready to bolt back out the door, but before I could move, I heard the lock click. Someone was standing there, just inside the door. I hadn't even heard them come in. It was a man, tall, mid-30s maybe, wearing a heavy jacket like he'd just come in from outside. He was holding a grocery bag in one hand, but he wasn't looking at it. He was looking at me. "What are you doing in here?" he said. His voice was calm, but there was an edge to it, like he was waiting for me to say the wrong thing. I'm sorry," I stammered. "I think I made a mistake. I thought this was my apartment." I tried to move toward the door, but he didn't step aside. He just stood there, staring at me, and then he set the grocery bag down slowly, deliberately, like he had all the time in the world. "You thought this was your apartment?" he repeated. His tone didn't change, but his eyes stayed locked on mine. "That's what you're going with?" "Yes," I said. My voice felt weak, like it wasn't carrying the words right. "I live upstairs. I must have gotten off on the wrong floor. I'm really sorry." He didn't respond right away. Instead, he reached behind him and slid the deadbolt shut. The sound of it snapping into place made my heart jump. "Then why didn't you leave when you realized it wasn't yours?" he asked. "I was about to," I said quickly. "I swear, I just realized." "Don't lie to me," he cut in. His voice wasn't calm anymore. It was sharp, almost angry, but still quiet. He took a step closer, and I stepped back without thinking. My heel hit the edge of a coffee table, and I nearly tripped. "I'm not lying," I said. My voice cracked, and I hated how scared I sounded. "I swear, it was just a mistake. Please, I'll leave right now." He didn't move for a moment, just kept staring at me. Then he nodded slowly, like he was thinking something over. "Okay," he said. "If it was just a mistake, let's talk about it. Sit down." I don't need to sit down," I said, trying to sound calm. "I'll just sit down." It wasn't a request. He wasn't yelling, but the way he said it left no room for argument. I sat on the couch, my hands shaking, and he stayed standing, just watching me. "What's your name?" he asked. I told him. My voice felt so small in the silence. "And you live upstairs?" "Yes," I said. "Just one floor up." "What's your apartment number?" I told him, hoping he'd believe me, hoping he'd let me leave. He nodded again, slowly, like he was filing the information away. "You know," he said, "people don't just walk into the wrong apartment. Not by accident." "It was an accident," I said, my voice shaking. "I swear." I wasn't paying attention. He tilted his head, studying me like he was trying to decide if I was worth believing. Then he stepped closer, leaning down so we were at eye level. "Do you know how many break-ins happen in this building?" he asked. His voice was low, almost a whisper. "Do you know what people like you do when they think no one's home?" "I'm not a thief," I said quickly. "I promise, I'm not." "You think I don't know what you're doing?" he interrupted. "You think I don't see it?" I didn't know what to say. My throat felt dry, and my chest was tight. I wanted to get up, to push past him and run, but I didn't dare move. He stood there for what felt like forever, just staring at me. Then he reached into his pocket, and my stomach dropped. I thought he was going to pull out a weapon, but instead, he took out his phone. He held it up, like he was going to call someone. "I should call the cops," he said. "Please don't," I said, my voice breaking. "I didn't do anything. I swear. It was just a mistake." He stared at me for another long moment, then lowered the phone. "Get out," he said. I didn't wait for him to say it again. I got up and moved toward the door as fast as I could without running. My hands were shaking so badly I could barely unlock the deadbolt. I felt his eyes on me the whole time. When I finally got the door open, I stepped out into the hallway and turned back. He was still standing there, watching me, his face completely unreadable. He didn't say anything else, just stood there until I closed the door behind me. I ran up the stairs to my actual apartment and locked the door the second I was inside. My hands wouldn't stop shaking, and my heart felt like it was going to explode. I didn't sleep that night, or the night after. Every time I close my eyes, I see his face. I don't know what he thought I was doing or why he let me go, but I haven't been able to stop thinking about it. It was late, maybe around 9 or 10 p.m., when my car broke down on Route 17. I was headed back home after visiting my sister, and it was one of those stretches of highway with nothing but fields and trees on either side. The nearest town was at least 20 miles back, and my phone had barely a single bar of service. I was trying not to panic, but the thought of sitting there all night wasn't exactly comforting. I popped the hood and stared at the engine like I knew what I was looking at. I didn't. Everything seemed fine to me, but the car wouldn't start. The battery was new, and I had gas, so I couldn't figure out what the problem was. I tried calling for roadside assistance, but the call wouldn't go through. That's when I saw the headlights. They came up slow, like whoever was driving was being careful. I stood by my car, waving my arms to make sure they saw me. A truck pulled over to the side, an older model, maybe from the 80s or 90s. The driver got out, a tall man with a thick build, wearing a flannel shirt and jeans. He had a calm, steady way about him. "You all right?" he asked, his voice deep and even. "My car just died," I said. "I can't figure out what's wrong, and my phone's not working." He nodded and walked over to my car without another word. He leaned over the engine, fiddling with a couple of things while I stood off to the side. After a minute, he straightened up and wiped his hands on a rag from his pocket. "Looks like it might be the fuel pump," he said. "You're not going anywhere tonight." I felt my stomach drop. "What should I do?" "Well," he said, "I've got a garage not far from here. I can tow you there. Take a closer look." I hesitated. Something about him made me uneasy, but I didn't have many options. It was either him or wait for someone else to come by, and who knew how long that would take. "All right," I said finally. He went back to his truck and pulled out a tow chain, hooking it up to my car. The whole time, he didn't say much. I tried to make small talk, asking if he lived nearby, but his answers were short, almost clipped. The ride to his garage wasn't long, maybe 10 minutes, but it felt longer. We turned off the main road onto a dirt path that wound through the trees. There weren't any lights except for his headlights, and the further we went, the darker it got. I started to regret my decision, but it was too late to back out. The garage was a small, run-down building with peeling paint and a single overhead light that flickered. He unhooked my car and waved me toward the entrance. "Come on in," he said. "I'll take a look." I followed him inside, and my unease grew. The place was cluttered with old tools, car parts, and a thick layer of dust. There was a smell, too oil mixed with something sour. He motioned for me to sit on a worn-out chair near the wall while he pulled the hood of my car open again. I tried to stay calm, but the way he moved felt off. He wasn't really looking at the engine, just sort of going through the motions. I noticed his eyes darting toward me every so often, like he was checking to see if I was watching him. "Do you have any family nearby?" he asked suddenly. "No," I said. "Why?" "Just making conversation," he said, his tone flat. I shifted in my seat, feeling the tension in the air. I glanced toward the door, calculating how far I'd have to run to get to it if something went wrong. He closed the hood and turned to face me. "Fuel pump shot," he said. "I can order the part, but it'll take a day or two." "I can call someone to pick me up," I said, standing. "Thanks for your help." "You're not going anywhere," he said, his voice cold now. "Your phone doesn't work, remember?" I froze. The way he said it wasn't a suggestion, it was a statement. I forced myself to smile, trying to act like I wasn't scared. "I'll just wait outside," I said, moving toward the door. He stepped in front of me, blocking my path. "You're staying here," he said. "It's not safe out there at night." My heart was pounding now. I tried to step around him, but he grabbed my arm. His grip was strong, and his eyes had a strange intensity. "Let go of me," I said, my voice shaking. He didn't. Instead, he pulled me back toward the chair and pushed me into it. "You're making this harder than it needs to be," he said. I didn't wait to see what he meant. I twisted out of his grip and ran for the door. He shouted something behind me, but I didn't stop. I made it outside and sprinted toward the trees. My legs were burning, and my lungs felt like they were on fire, but I didn't dare slow down. I could hear him behind me, his heavy footsteps crunching on the gravel. He was faster than I expected, and I knew I couldn't outrun him. I spotted a thick cluster of bushes and dove into them, crouching low and trying to quiet my breathing. He stopped nearby, his footsteps slowing. I could hear him muttering to himself, his voice low and angry. He walked past my hiding spot, and I waited until I couldn't hear him anymore before I moved. I crept through the trees, trying to put as much distance between us as I could. After what felt like hours, I saw headlights in the distance. I ran toward the road and flagged down a passing car. The driver was an older woman, and she took one look at me and knew something was wrong. She didn't ask questions, just told me to get in. She drove me to the nearest town, where I called the police. They found my car at the garage, but the man was gone. They said the place had been abandoned for years, and they'd had reports of strange activity in the area before. I never found out who he was or what he wanted, but I've never driven that stretch of highway again. I remember the day clearly because it started so ordinary. I was working from home, sitting at my desk in the living room with my laptop open. Around mid-morning, the internet went out. I tried resetting the modem a couple of times, but nothing worked. It was frustrating since I had a meeting in less than an hour. Before I could call the service provider, there was a knock on the door. When I opened it, there was a man standing there in a uniform shirt with the company logo stitched on. He had a tool belt around his waist and a clipboard in his hand. "Hi, I'm with the internet service. We got reports of outages in the area," he said. His voice was calm, friendly even. I hadn't called them yet, but I figured someone else must have. I asked if he needed to check anything, and he nodded. "Yeah, I'll need to look at your modem and wiring," he said, glancing past me into the house. I let him in, thinking nothing of it. He followed me to the living room where the modem was. As he worked, he asked questions. At first, they were normal, like how long the internet had been out or if I'd noticed any other issues. Then they started to get personal. "Do you live here alone?" he asked, crouching by the modem. I hesitated but told him no, my husband would be back soon. That wasn't true, my husband was out of town for the week, but something about the question made me uncomfortable. "Oh, good," he said, smiling up at me. "It's nice to have someone around. Makes the place feel less lonely." He finished looking at the modem and stood up. "I'll need to check outside, near the wiring box. Can you show me where that is?" I led him to the back door, pointing out the box on the side of the house. He nodded but didn't go outside right away. Instead, he lingered in the doorway, looking around the kitchen and then back at me. "This is a nice house," he said. "How long have you lived here?" "About 5 years," I said, keeping my answer short now. He stepped closer to the counter, looking at the photos I had pinned on the fridge. "You've got a nice family," he said, pointing at a picture of me, my husband, and our dog. I didn't respond, just stood there, hoping he'd go outside already. After a few more seconds, he finally stepped out the back door. I closed it behind him and locked it. I went back to the living room, watching through the window as he pretended to inspect the wiring box. He wasn't doing much, just walking around, looking at his clipboard, and glancing back at the house. That's when I noticed his van parked on the street. It was plain white, no company logo on the side. My stomach sank. I grabbed my phone and searched for the number for the internet company. When I called, the representative said there hadn't been any technicians dispatched to my area that day. My heart was pounding as I hung up. I went to the front door and peeked through the peephole. The van was still there, and he hadn't come back inside yet, but I knew I needed to act fast. I locked all the doors and windows and ran to the bedroom, grabbing my husband's old baseball bat from the closet. Then I called 911. The operator kept me on the line while I waited for the police. She told me to stay quiet and keep the doors locked. I could barely hear her over the sound of my own breathing. After a few minutes, I heard footsteps on the back porch. He was back, knocking on the door. "Ma'am," he called out. "I need to check something inside again." I didn't answer. The knocking got louder. "Ma'am, are you there?" "I just need a few more minutes." I stayed hidden in the bedroom, clutching the bat so tightly my hands hurt. The knocking stopped, and everything went quiet. I thought maybe he'd left, but then I heard a noise at one of the windows. The operator was still on the line, telling me to stay calm. She said officers were on their way. I heard the sound of glass breaking. He was trying to get in. I stayed where I was, shaking and gripping the bat, until I finally heard sirens outside. The police arrived just in time. They found him trying to climb through the broken window. It turned out he wasn't with the internet company at all. He'd stolen the uniform, shirt, and equipment. He had a criminal record, too, for burglary and assault. The police said I did the right thing by not letting him back in and calling 911. They didn't think he was here to fix anything. Even now, I can't stop thinking about how easily I let him into my home. It's terrifying to think about what could have happened if I hadn't trusted my instincts. I don't know how to explain what happened that night, but I know I'll never forget it. I still wake up sometimes thinking I hear footsteps outside my tent, even though I know I'm safe now. I've been camping a lot in my life, mostly by myself. It's the only way I can really clear my head, get away from everything, and just think. I'd gone out to a remote site in the woods, not too far from town, but far enough that I was pretty much alone. The kind of place where you're not likely to run into anyone. It was my second night out there. I had set up camp by a small creek, surrounded by tall trees. The sun had set hours ago, and the fire had burned down to embers. I was inside my tent, reading a book and listening to the sounds of the night. It wasn't a full moon, but the sky was clear, and there was just enough light from the stars and the glow of the embers to see a little around the campsite. Around 1 a.m., I started hearing something. At first, I thought it was just the wind moving through the trees, but then I realized it was something more distinct: footsteps. I didn't want to overthink it, but they were too close, too deliberate. I froze, holding my breath, listening. The footsteps were light, but they were steady and moving around the perimeter of my tent, circling it. I lay there in the dark, tense, unsure of what to do. My heart was pounding, and I could feel the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. I didn't move. I didn't make a sound. I tried to convince myself it was just an animal, maybe a deer or a raccoon. But the steps weren't the kind you'd expect from wildlife. They were heavier, more purposeful. I heard them pause for a moment, then resume walking. My mind raced. Could it be another camper? Was someone lost? But I hadn't seen anyone else around. There were no other camps nearby, and the thought of someone else being out here this late walking around my tent, so close, was enough to make my stomach twist. I couldn't help myself. I had to look. Slowly, I unzipped the tent, just a little, and peered out into the dark. The forest was eerily quiet now. No more footsteps. It was hard to see much beyond the reach of the dim light from my campfire. The shadows of the trees stretched across the ground, but there was nothing there. No person, no animal, nothing. I shut the tent flap quickly, my hands shaking. I didn't know what to think, but I couldn't shake the feeling that someone had been right outside, watching. It felt wrong, like I wasn't supposed to be there. I spent the next few hours awake, listening for any other sounds. Every creak of a branch, every rustle of leaves, made me tense up. I didn't sleep at all. I kept expecting to hear the footsteps again, but nothing came. Finally, around 4 a.m., I must have dozed off because I woke up to the sound of birds chirping, sunlight peeking through the fabric of my tent. I lay there for a moment, trying to calm myself down. The night felt like a strange dream, but I knew it wasn't. The footsteps, the silence, the feeling that someone had been so close it was real. I didn't even want to check outside, but I knew I had to. I needed to see if anything was out of place, or if I was just being paranoid. I unzipped the tent slowly, carefully, and stepped outside. The air was cool, and the ground was damp with morning dew. The fire was just a pile of cold ashes now, and everything was still. At first glance, it seemed like nothing had changed. But then I noticed something. My gear, my backpack, and some of the other things I had left around the tent had been moved. Not by a lot, but enough that it wasn't where I'd left it. My backpack, which had been leaning against a tree, was now lying a few feet away, half open. My water bottle had been knocked over, and the small flashlight I always kept by my side was in a different spot than I remembered. It wasn't a huge mess, but it was clear that someone had been through my things. My stomach turned. I checked the rest of the camp. The area around the tent was untouched, but I still had that sick feeling in the pit of my stomach. I walked over to the creek and looked down at the water. Everything seemed normal, but I couldn't shake the feeling that someone had been there. That someone had been watching me all night. The worst part was the silence. There were no other campers nearby. No one else in the woods. The footsteps I heard, they couldn't have been from an animal. No animal would have been so close to my tent and walked around it in such a deliberate way. I couldn't explain it. I packed up my things as quickly as I could, trying to get out of there. I wasn't going to stay another night. I didn't care if I was being paranoid. Something wasn't right. Whoever had been out there, they knew I was alone. And I had no idea if they were still out there, waiting. As I loaded up my gear into my truck, I kept looking over my shoulder, expecting to see someone walking toward me from the trees. But there was nothing. Just the woods, quiet as ever. I didn't tell anyone about it. I didn't want to sound crazy, but I couldn't stop thinking about that night. The footsteps. The way everything had been moved. I don't know if I'll ever understand who or what it was. But I know I'm never camping alone in those woods again. The thought that someone could be out there, watching, that close, it's something I can't shake. I've been camping a lot, and I've always loved the solitude that comes with being in the wilderness. I'm not the kind of person who gets scared easily, especially when I'm out in nature. I usually find peace there. But what happened to me last year, in a remote spot I'd never been to before, has completely changed the way I think about being alone in the woods. It started out like any other solo trip. I found a spot off the beaten path, no one around for miles, just me and the trees. I set up my tent as usual, made a small fire, and started cooking dinner. The air was crisp, and it was quiet except for the occasional rustling of leaves. Nothing unusual. Just the kind of peaceful, serene setting I had been craving. That night, after I had eaten and the fire had died down, I crawled into my sleeping bag, tired but content. The night was cold, the kind of cold that makes you appreciate being tucked inside a warm sleeping bag. The wind picked up a little, making the trees sway. Everything was calm until I heard it. At first, it was just a faint sound, a soft crunch of dirt or leaves. I figured it was probably an animal, a deer maybe, moving through the forest. But then it stopped. Just like that. I froze, listening. Everything went quiet. A few minutes passed, and I tried to settle back down, thinking it was nothing. But then I heard it again. The crunching sound, this time louder. Closer. My heart started to beat faster. I tried not to overthink it. Maybe it was an animal. Maybe it was the wind. I pulled the covers tighter and listened again. There it was. Footsteps. No animal would make that kind of sound. These were heavy, deliberate steps. Whoever or whatever was out there was moving slowly, carefully, as if they were trying not to make noise, but failing. I couldn't help it. I grabbed the flashlight I always keep by my side and unzipped the tent a little, just enough to peek outside. The night was pitch black, except for the glow of my campfire, which had nearly burned out. The light barely reached beyond the small circle around the fire. But in that small light, I didn't see anything. No movement. No figure. Just shadows. I waited a few more minutes, trying to convince myself it was nothing. Probably just a raccoon or some other animal. But the footsteps started again. Only this time, they were closer. A lot closer. I could hear them clearly, and they weren't moving like an animal. It was human, or at least, something walking like a human. My breath caught in my throat. I knew I had to do something. I grabbed my knife for protection and unzipped the tent fully, stepping outside, shining my flashlight in every direction. The air was still and cold. The footsteps stopped as soon as I was outside, but I couldn't see anyone. No movement. I checked the surrounding trees, the shadows, but everything was still. My heart was pounding in my chest. I stood there for a long moment, listening. The only sounds I could hear were the wind and the occasional crackling from my campfire. There was no one. I started to think I was just imagining things. I was alone. I knew I was alone. But then, just as I was about to go back into the tent, I heard it again. This time, it was behind me. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up. I spun around, but there was nothing there. The footsteps stopped again, and I felt that strange, uneasy silence surrounding me. My instincts were telling me to stay calm, but I was scared. I don't scare easily, but that night, alone in the dark, I felt like something wasn't right. I spent the rest of the night awake, lying there with the knife in my hand, trying to stay as quiet as possible. Every time I almost drifted off, I'd hear the footsteps again. They seemed to be circling me, like whoever it was knew I was listening and was waiting for me to let my guard down. It felt like they were taunting me, getting closer every time, but when I tried to confront them, they would stop, leaving me in a tense, silent waiting game. Hours passed like this. Finally, when the first light of morning broke through the trees, I heard nothing anymore. The footsteps stopped for good. I didn't sleep at all that night, just kept my eyes open, waiting, hoping the morning would bring some relief. And when I finally saw the sun starting to rise, I packed up my things quickly. I wasn't staying another minute. When I got out of the tent to stretch my legs and gather my stuff, I saw something that made my blood run cold. Around my campsite, all the way around the fire pit and my tent, were muddy footprints. They weren't animal tracks. These were human tracks, big ones, like a man's boots. And they were all over the place, going in circles around my camp, getting close to my tent, and then veering off. There was no mistaking it. Someone had been there. Someone had been walking around my tent all night, and I didn't hear them leave. I couldn't make sense of it. The tracks were fresh, but there was no sign of anyone nearby now. No sign of them leaving or anything else out of the ordinary. But the realization hit me like a punch in the gut. Whoever it was had been watching me, and they had been there the entire night, just out of my sight, circling my camp. I don't know why they hadn't done anything else, but the thought of it sent me into a panic. I packed up my gear as fast as I could, not even bothering to make sure everything was perfectly packed. I just wanted to get out of there. The whole way back to the car, I kept looking over my shoulder, half expecting to see someone following me. Every snap of a twig, every rustle in the trees made my heart race. But there was nothing. Nothing but the silence of the woods. I haven't gone camping alone since that trip, and I don't think I ever will again. Even now, just thinking about it, I feel that same chill down my spine. Whoever it was, whether they were just some kind of sick person playing games or someone with worse intentions, they knew exactly what they were doing. They knew how to move silently, how to make sure I never saw them. And I'll never forget those muddy footprints circling my camp, the footsteps I heard all night, always stopping just when I tried to confront them. Something about that situation felt so wrong, like I wasn't supposed to be there, like I was never meant to leave. If there's one thing I've learned from that night, it's that the woods aren't always as peaceful as they seem. And when you're alone out there, anything can happen. Anything at all. When I first found the spot, I thought I'd hit the jackpot. It was a clearing near a small stream, tucked away in the woods about a mile from the nearest trail. It wasn't marked on any maps I had, and it felt like it had been untouched for years. The place was perfect, quiet, peaceful, and far from anyone else. I set up my tent in the middle of the clearing, built a small fire ring with stones, and laid out my gear. The first day was uneventful. I spent the afternoon exploring the area, following the stream upstream until the terrain got too rough, then doubling back. I didn't see a single person or any sign that anyone had been there recently. Just the way I liked it. By the time evening rolled around, I was tired but content. I cooked a quick meal over the fire and watched the sun dip below the trees before crawling into my tent for the night. The next morning, I woke up to the sound of rain tapping on the tent. It wasn't heavy, just a light drizzle, but it made everything damp and a little colder than I'd hoped. I spent most of the morning huddled near the fire, drinking coffee and reading a book I'd brought along. When the rain let up around noon, I decided to stretch my legs and explore some more. I hadn't gone far, maybe 100 yards from camp, when I noticed it. At first, I thought it was just a tree stump, but as I got closer, I realized it was something else. It was a trail camera, strapped to a tree, aimed directly at my campsite. The sight of it made my stomach drop. It hadn't been there the day before, I was sure of it. I'd walked this same area when I was setting up camp, and I would have noticed something like that. The camera was one of those compact ones with camouflage casing, the kind hunters or wildlife researchers use. Its lens was pointed straight at the clearing where my tent stood. I stared at it for a long time, trying to make sense of it. Who had put it there? And why? My first thought was that maybe it was left by a hunter, but it didn't make sense. It was aimed too precisely at my camp. Not at a game trail or a clearing where animals might wander through at me. I looked around, scanning the woods for any sign of someone watching. The trees were thick, the undergrowth dense, but I didn't see anyone. The woods were silent except for the occasional chirp of a bird or the rustle of leaves in the breeze. Still, the feeling of being watched was overwhelming. I walked back to the camera and stared at it again. I considered taking it down or smashing it, but something stopped me. If someone was watching, would they get angry? Would they come back to check on it and find me here? The thought sent a shiver down my spine. I decided to leave it alone for now and head back to camp. My mind was racing with possibilities, none of them good. I told myself I was overreacting, that it was probably nothing. Maybe it had been there the whole time, and I just hadn't noticed. But I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. When I got back to camp, I tried to distract myself by packing up some of my gear and tidying up. The clearing felt different now, less like a peaceful retreat and more like a stage with a spotlight on it. I kept glancing toward the tree line, half expecting someone to step out at any moment. By the time evening came, I was on edge. I didn't bother starting a fire. I didn't want to draw attention to myself. Instead, I ate some cold food from my pack and sat in the tent, listening to the woods. The rain had started again, heavier this time, and the sound of it hitting the tent drowned out everything else. I don't know how long I sat there before I heard it. It was faint at first, barely audible over the rain, but it was there, the sound of footsteps. Slow, deliberate, crunching through the wet undergrowth. They were coming from the direction of the trail camera. I froze, my heart pounding in my chest. The footsteps grew louder, closer. Whoever it was, they weren't trying to be quiet. I grabbed the small pocket knife I kept in my pack, not that it would do much good, and held it tightly. The footsteps stopped just outside the clearing. I could feel my pulse in my ears, my breathing shallow and ragged. Then, after what felt like an eternity, I heard the sound of something being adjusted. A click, like a latch being undone, followed by the faint rustle of fabric or plastic. They were doing something to the camera. I didn't dare move or make a sound. I stayed perfectly still, gripping the knife so hard my hand hurt. After a few minutes, the footsteps started again, heading back the way they'd come. I waited until the sound faded completely before I let myself breathe. I didn't sleep that night. I stayed in the tent, listening to every sound, every rustle of leaves or crack of a branch. The rain eventually stopped, leaving the woods eerily quiet. When dawn finally came, I didn't waste any time. I packed up my gear as quickly as I could, constantly glancing over my shoulder. I didn't even bother eating breakfast. I just wanted to get out of there. As I hiked back toward the trailhead, I passed by the tree where the camera had been. It was gone. Whoever had put it there had taken it during the night. I don't know who they were or what they wanted, and I don't want to find out. I haven't been camping since. The woods don't feel the same anymore. They don't feel safe. It was late, and the rain hadn't stopped all day. I was at the library trying to finish an essay that was already overdue, my laptop battery at 3%, and I still had no idea how to end the last paragraph. The lights flickered once, and I knew I couldn't push it any longer. When I packed up my things, the library was nearly empty. The rain outside had gotten heavier, the kind that turns streets into rivers. I sighed, looking at the umbrellas in the stand near the door. Mine was gone. Someone must have taken it by mistake, but I wasn't going to walk home in this weather without one. I grabbed a plain black umbrella that looked just like mine and stepped outside. The walk to my apartment wasn't far, just 10 minutes if I cut through the small park on the edge of campus. The rain made the whole world quieter. There was nothing but the sound of water hitting the pavement and the occasional car hissing by. The streets were empty, and most of the streetlights were reflected in puddles. I kept my head down and tried not to think about how cold it was. I noticed the man when I turned onto the path through the park. He was standing by one of the benches, his head tilted up, like he was looking at the rain. He had no umbrella or hood, just a dark jacket that clung to his shoulders. At first, I thought he was just someone who liked the rain, maybe taking a break from wherever he was going. But as I passed him, he turned and started walking in the same direction. I didn't think much of it. It was a public path, after all, and it wasn't unusual to see other students cutting through here. Still, something about the way his footsteps matched mine made me uneasy. I glanced back, and he was closer than I thought, his face hard to make out in the dim light. "Hey," he called, his voice sharp and clear over the rain. "That's my umbrella." I stopped, gripping the handle tighter. "What?" He took a few steps closer, his face coming into the light. He was older than me, maybe mid-30s, with wet hair plastered to his forehead and dark eyes that didn't seem to blink. "You took my umbrella," he said, his tone flat. I looked at the umbrella in my hand. It was just a plain black one, nothing special. "This was in the stand," I said. "I thought it was mine." "If it's yours, I'm sorry." "Here." I held it out to him, but he didn't take it. Instead, he just stared at me, water dripping from his face. "You took it," he repeated, like I hadn't just offered it back. I felt my stomach tighten. There was something about the way he said it, like he wasn't just talking about the umbrella. "Look, I'm sorry," I said again, a little more firmly. "Take it." He still didn't move. I didn't know what else to do, so I set the umbrella on the ground and started walking again. The rain was colder now, soaking through my clothes, but I didn't care. I just wanted to get home. His footsteps started again behind me. "Hey," he called again, louder this time. "Wait." I ignored him, picking up my pace. My apartment building wasn't far now, just at the edge of the park. I could see the lights in the windows, warm and inviting. I was almost there when I heard his footsteps break into a run. Panic hit me like a wave, and I started running too, the water splashing around my ankles. My bag banged against my hip, and I could feel my heart pounding in my ears. I didn't look back. I didn't need to. I could hear him getting closer, his breaths loud and uneven. I reached the door of my building and fumbled for my keys, my hands shaking. I glanced over my shoulder, and he was there, just a few feet away, his face pale and twisted with something I couldn't name. "Give it back," he shouted, his voice raw. "I left it on the path." I shouted back, my voice breaking. "It's right there." He didn't seem to hear me. His hand shot out, grabbing my arm. His grip was like iron, his fingers digging into my skin. I screamed, twisting away, and the movement sent me crashing into the door. My keys slipped from my fingers and fell into the puddle at my feet. "Let go!" I yelled, my voice cracking. He didn't say anything this time, just pulled harder, dragging me away from the door. His strength was terrifying. I kicked out, my foot connecting with his shin, and he stumbled just enough for me to wrench free. I grabbed my keys and jammed them into the lock, throwing the door open and slamming it shut behind me. I stood there, gasping for breath, my back pressed against the door. The small window at the top was fogged with rain, but I could see him standing there, his hands pressed against the glass, his face twisted in anger. "You took it," he said again, his voice muffled but still clear. "You don't get to keep it." I didn't know what he meant. It was just an umbrella. A stupid, cheap umbrella. He stayed there for a long moment, his hands sliding down the glass, leaving streaks of water. Then he turned and walked away, disappearing into the rain. I didn't sleep that night. I kept expecting to hear him pounding on the door or see his face at the window. The next morning, when the rain finally stopped, I went back to the park. The umbrella was gone. I'll start by saying that I never wanted to be in that basement. Ever. I never asked to be there. But that night, everything changed. It had been raining heavily for days, and the forecast predicted another storm. I had just moved into the house, a quiet, somewhat secluded place on the edge of town. The house was old, but I loved it. It was the kind of place you could picture yourself growing old in, with a big front porch and an overgrown garden in the back. It had character, sure, but it was perfect for me. At least, that's what I thought. It wasn't long before I noticed the flooding. I started to hear strange sounds from the basement, but I ignored them at first. Old houses make noise, right? The first time I went down there, I was just going to check on some boxes I had shoved to the back. When I opened the door, the damp smell hit me. Not unusual, I thought. It had been rainy, and the basement was always a little musty. The next morning, I went down again to grab a few things, and that's when I saw the water. It was only a couple inches deep, but enough to make me uneasy. The storm wasn't supposed to hit until later, but it seemed like the house had taken on more water than I realized. I went back upstairs to grab towels and a mop, trying to get ahead of it before it became too much. By the time I returned, the water had risen even higher. Panic set in, but I kept calm. I started moving the boxes, books, and some of the furniture that had been left in the basement when I moved in. There were some family heirlooms I didn't want to lose. The water was getting colder, creeping into the edges of the room. It was clear the basement had some drainage issues, but it was too late now to worry about that. I was kneeling, shifting one of the boxes, when I noticed something odd. A section of the wall near the back of the basement was different. The wood looked slightly darker, almost like it had been exposed to water more than the rest of the walls. There was a small gap at the bottom, barely noticeable, but it was enough to make me curious. I stood up and moved toward it, my heart starting to beat a little faster. The water lapped at my boots as I knelt down to inspect it. My fingers brushed the edge of the wall. It was strange, cold to the touch, and slightly damp. I pushed against it with more force than I meant to, and the panel shifted. I froze. Behind the panel, there was a small space. I wasn't sure if it was a mistake or something intentional, but it looked like the wall had been covering a hidden door, one I hadn't noticed when I moved in. My breath caught in my throat, and I suddenly didn't know if I wanted to open it. But I couldn't stop myself. I grabbed the edge of the panel, pulled it out, and revealed the dark opening behind it. The air felt colder, and the basement seemed to get quieter somehow. The rain outside was still coming down hard, but it almost sounded muffled in comparison to the silence in the basement. I found a small wooden door, old and warped. There was no handle, but there were markings on the wood, deep gouges, almost like something had scraped along the surface for a long time. I hesitated, staring at the door. Something about it felt off, but I pushed past the feeling and grabbed the edge, pulling it open. It creaked loudly as it moved, and my stomach dropped. Inside was a small, dimly lit room. The air in there was musty, stale, and so cold it made my skin crawl. I didn't want to go inside, but I couldn't look away. There was something about it that pulled me in, like it was waiting for me. I stepped inside. The room was tiny, barely big enough for a few people to stand in. At first, I didn't notice anything unusual, just some old, rotting furniture and dust everywhere. But then I saw them items scattered around the floor. Old, strange objects that didn't belong there. I didn't know what to make of it at first. Some of it looked like trash, old papers, broken glass, but there were others, things that I couldn't explain. There was a chair in the corner, stained with something that wasn't just dirt. My heart raced as I looked closer at the items. On the floor next to the chair, there was a small, old-fashioned mirror. It was cracked, but there was something about it that made me feel uneasy, like it was watching me. My mind was starting to race, trying to make sense of everything. I stepped back, my body trembling. Something told me to leave, but my feet wouldn't move. In the middle of the room, there was a small, worn wooden box. I approached it slowly, not sure if I really wanted to open it, but I did. Inside, there were more things, more disturbing items, a handful of dried flowers, a faded photograph of a woman I didn't recognize, and something wrapped in an old, dirty cloth. I unwrapped the cloth, and that's when I found it. A small, rusted key. It was so old that it looked like it shouldn't even exist anymore. My hands shook as I held it. But the more I stared at it, the more I realized that this was no random collection of forgotten belongings. It was deliberate. Someone had placed everything here, and it was meant for someone, maybe me, to find. I stood there, still holding the key, the dark room pressing in around me. My instinct screamed at me to leave, but I couldn't stop staring at the key. And then, just as I was about to step back, I heard it. A noise. From upstairs. A door creaked, followed by footsteps, slow, deliberate footsteps. Someone was in the house. Someone who shouldn't have been. I couldn't breathe. I dropped the key, my heart pounding in my chest as I turned and bolted toward the door. But as I reached it, I glanced over my shoulder. I couldn't stop myself. The chair in the corner was different. Someone had moved it. It wasn't where I had left it. I didn't wait. I ran back upstairs, my pulse thundering in my ears. I didn't even bother to check the water in the basement. The flooding, the room, the key, it all seemed too real, too horrifying to comprehend. I got out of the house that night. I called a friend to pick me up and never went back. The place was left behind, and I couldn't bring myself to touch it. I still wonder who lived there before me, and what they were hiding. And, more than anything, I wonder if they're still watching from that dark room. I still can't shake the feeling of unease that came over me the moment I walked into that hospital room. It had been a long day. My friend, Emily, had been in an accident, nothing major, just a car crash, but she'd been unconscious for a few days. The doctors told me she was stable, but I couldn't shake the worry that gripped me every time I thought about her lying there, alone. When I arrived at the hospital, it was late, around 9 p.m. The hallways were quieter than usual, just a few people here and there, some nurses passing by, a doctor with a tired look in his eyes. I checked in at the front desk, and the nurse directed me to Emily's room. She was on the 3rd floor, down at the end of the hall, in room 312. I walked toward the room, feeling that familiar mix of worry and hope. When I got to the door, I knocked lightly, just in case Emily was awake. I wasn't sure what I'd do if she was, considering she was still mostly unconscious, but I felt better doing it anyway. I heard a soft voice from inside, "Come in." I pushed open the door and stepped in, expecting to see Emily lying in her hospital bed, but what I saw first was the nurse standing over her. At first, I didn't think anything of it. I was tired, and it had been a long drive, so I wasn't fully alert. But as soon as I saw the nurse, something about her made my stomach twist. She was too still, almost unnaturally so, and she didn't seem to notice me walking in. The woman was tall, dressed in the standard blue scrubs, but she wasn't moving the way a nurse should. She was standing over Emily's bed, watching her closely, her hands hovering just above Emily's body like she was waiting for something. It struck me as strange, but I figured she was just doing her job. I cleared my throat, trying to get her attention. "Excuse me, I'm here to see my friend." The woman didn't react immediately. She only turned her head toward me slowly, like I had startled her. When she did, her face was calm, too calm. She gave me a small smile, but there was something off about it. "Oh, I didn't hear you come in. You must be her friend. I'm just making sure she's comfortable." I nodded, feeling an odd shiver creep up my spine. "Thanks for looking after her. I've been so worried." She nodded in return, but her gaze didn't leave me. It was almost as though she was studying me, like she was trying to decide whether or not she should trust me. The smile was still there, but it didn't reach her eyes. Something about those eyes, something cold, made me feel like I didn't belong in the room. "Is she doing okay?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. "She's fine," the nurse said, her voice a little too smooth. "We've been keeping an eye on her. She's resting." I glanced at Emily in the bed. She looked peaceful, but there was something about her stillness that bothered me. Maybe it was just the drugs, but it felt unnatural, too quiet, too still for someone recovering from an accident. I couldn't put my finger on it, but I felt like something wasn't right. The nurse had moved a little closer to Emily as I stood there, and I noticed that she had her hand on Emily's wrist. A little too firm for a nurse, I thought. Nurses are usually gentle when they check vitals or when they make sure a patient's comfortable. But this woman's hand was too tight. I took a small step forward. "Are you sure everything is okay with her?" The nurse didn't answer right away. Instead, she turned her gaze back to Emily, her fingers still pressing down hard on Emily's wrist. "She's just fine," she said, her voice taking on a slight edge now, a subtle change that didn't quite match her calm demeanor. "You should go sit down. Let her rest." I was beginning to feel uncomfortable, but I didn't want to make a scene. I moved toward the chair by the window, keeping my eyes on the nurse. As I sat down, I glanced back toward Emily. That's when I noticed something that made my blood run cold. There was a small, thin line of blood near Emily's mouth. I wasn't sure if it was new or if it had been there for a while, but it didn't seem right. I had been here earlier in the day, and I was sure I hadn't seen it then. I looked back at the nurse, who was now busy adjusting the foreline near Emily's arm. I wanted to ask what had happened, but something in the back of my mind told me to be careful. I wasn't sure what was going on, but I didn't like it. I stood up from the chair, my legs a little shaky now, and I approached the bed slowly. "I'm going to check on her," I said. The nurse's expression hardened. "I told you she's fine," she said in a low voice, her words clipped, as if warning me. I ignored her and leaned closer to Emily, gently brushing her hair back from her face. Her skin felt cold, colder than it should. And then I saw it, the faint bruise on her neck, right beneath her jaw. It was barely noticeable, but it was there. A bruise like that couldn't happen from just the accident, not unless something else had happened. I pulled back, suddenly terrified, and when I looked up, I saw the nurse was no longer by the force stand. She was standing directly behind me now, so close that I could feel her breath on my neck. "What are you doing?" she asked, her voice just a little too low. I turned to face her, my heart pounding. "I think you need to leave," I said, the words coming out more forcefully than I meant. The nurse didn't flinch. She just stared at me, her eyes colder than before. "You're mistaken," she said, her voice calm again, but now I could hear something else in it. Something dark. "You don't need to worry about her. You just need to leave." I backed up toward the door, my eyes never leaving hers. I don't know what I thought I'd do if she didn't let me leave. But the moment I reached the door, I swung it open and hurried out into the hallway, looking for a nurse or doctor, anyone who might be able to help. I didn't stop. I just ran down the hall toward the nurse's station, where I found a woman sitting at a desk, looking through papers. "I need help," I gasped. "The nurse in room 312, she's not who she says she is." The woman looked confused, but she stood up and followed me back to the room, where we found no one. The bed was empty. Emily was gone. There were no signs of the nurse either. They found Emily later in another part of the hospital. She was unconscious again, and the doctor said she'd been sedated. They didn't know how she'd gotten out of her bed, but they did know she wasn't supposed to have been moved without supervision. I never saw that nurse again. They checked the hospital records, but there was no sign of anyone by her name or description working there. I don't know what happened in that room, but I'm sure I wasn't mistaken. I know what I saw. I just don't know how close I came to something worse happening. I had been job hunting for months when I got an email about an interview. It was for a position I'd applied to a few weeks earlier, some kind of administrative role. The email came from someone named Daniel Rowe, the hiring manager. The company, Bridgepoint Solutions, seemed legit. They had a basic website, nothing fancy, just enough to show they existed. The interview was set for 5 p.m. on a Friday. I remember thinking it was a weird time, but I didn't question it. The address was in the industrial area on the outskirts of the city. It wasn't far, maybe a 20-minute drive from my apartment. When I got there, it was already getting dark. The building was a large, gray structure, the kind of place you'd expect to see offices for logistics or manufacturing companies. The parking lot was almost empty except for a few cars scattered around. That felt strange, but I told myself it was because it was late on a Friday. I parked and walked to the front door. It looked clean and well kept, with a small plaque that read Bridgepoint Solutions. I pressed the buzzer, and a voice came through the speaker. "Come in." "Second floor," the man said. The door clicked, unlocking, and I stepped inside. The lobby was quiet. Too quiet. There was no receptionist, just an empty desk with a stack of outdated magazines. The air felt still, like no one had been there in a while. I told myself not to overthink it. Maybe they were cutting costs or working remotely. I took the stairs to the second floor. The hallway was dimly lit, and the fluorescent lights buzzed faintly. There were several doors, all closed. At the end of the hall was one door slightly ajar with a light on inside. A small sign next to it read Conference Room B. I knocked. "Come in," the same voice said. I stepped inside, and a man stood up from the table. He looked ordinary, dark hair, a button-up shirt, probably mid-40s. He smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. "You must be Emily," he said, holding out his hand. "Yes," I said, shaking it. His grip was firm, too firm, and his hand was cold. Something about him put me on edge, but I couldn't pinpoint what. Maybe it was the way he looked at me, like he was studying me. "Have a seat," he said, gesturing to a chair across the table. The room was sparse. Just a table, a few chairs, and a whiteboard with nothing written on it. No laptops, no paperwork, no sign of any actual business. I sat down, my stomach twisting. "So, tell me about yourself," he said, leaning forward. I started talking about my work experience, but he barely listened. His eyes were locked on mine the entire time, unblinking. He didn't take notes, didn't ask follow-up questions. When I paused, he just smiled again, that same empty smile. "Interesting," he said after a moment. You seem very qualified. Thank you, I said, forcing a smile. He didn't respond right away. Instead, he tilted his head slightly, like he was sizing me up. The silence stretched on too long. Do you live nearby? He asked suddenly. That question threw me. It had nothing to do with the job. About 20 minutes away, I said cautiously. He nodded, as if that was important information. Do you live alone? Now I was alarmed. That had nothing to do with the interview. I laughed nervously. Why do you ask? Just curious, he said, sitting back in his chair. His tone was casual, but his eyes were sharp, watching my every move. I decided I'd had enough. I don't think this is relevant to the position, I said, standing up. Thank you for your time. Sit down, he said, his voice low and firm. I froze. There was no friendliness in his tone anymore. He stood up, blocking the door. My heart started pounding. I tried to keep my voice steady. I think we're done here, I said, stepping toward the door. You're not going anywhere, he said, reaching into his pocket. He pulled out a knife, the blade catching the light. My blood ran cold. Don't scream, he said. If you do, I'll make this worse for you. I wanted to scream, to run, but I was paralyzed. My mind raced, trying to think of a way out. The room was small, and he was between me and the door. Please, I said, my voice barely a whisper. I won't tell anyone. Just let me go. He didn't answer. Instead, he stepped closer, the knife glinting in his hand. I backed up until I hit the wall, my breathing quick and shallow. Then I remembered my phone. It was in my bag, slung over the back of the chair. He hadn't taken it. If I could just distract him for a moment. Why are you doing this? I asked, trying to keep him talking. He smiled again, that same empty smile. Because I can, he said simply. While he spoke, I inched toward the chair, my fingers brushing the strap of my bag. I grabbed it and yanked it toward me, pretending to stumble. The movement startled him, and he lunged at me. I screamed and swung the bag at him with all my strength. It hit his arm, knocking the knife to the floor. I didn't stop to think. I grabbed the chair and slammed it into his chest, sending him stumbling back. I ran for the door, yanking it open and bolting down the hallway. He was right behind me, his footsteps pounding against the floor. My heart was racing so fast I thought it might burst. I reached the stairs and practically threw myself down them, skipping steps, nearly falling. I could hear him shouting behind me, but I didn't look back. When I reached the lobby, I ran straight for the door, fumbling with the lock. He was halfway down the stairs when I finally got it open. I sprinted to my car, jumped in, and locked the doors just as he burst out of the building. He pounded on the driver's side window, yelling something I couldn't hear over my own panic breathing. I started the car and peeled out of the parking lot, not stopping until I was miles away. When I finally pulled over, my hands were shaking so badly I could barely dial 911. The police didn't find him. When they searched the building, it was empty, and the knife was gone. The company? It didn't exist. The website was a fake, probably set up just to lure people like me. I don't know what would have happened if I hadn't gotten out of there, but I don't want to think about it. The rain started as I left work, a steady drizzle that turned into a downpour by the time I was halfway home. It wasn't unusual for the old highway to flood in spots, but I'd never had trouble before. I was in the middle of nowhere, no streetlights, no signs of life, just dark trees on both sides of the road. The sound of the rain on the roof was loud, like it was trying to drown out everything else. My car started acting up about 10 miles past the last town. The engine sputtered, and the dashboard lit up like a Christmas tree. I pulled over to the shoulder, trying not to panic. I turned the key again, but it just clicked. The rain kept pouring, and I could see the water pooling on the road. I grabbed my phone, but there was no signal. The screen just showed no service in the corner. I thought about walking, but I didn't even know where the next town was, and I wasn't dressed for the rain. I decided to wait it out. Maybe someone would come by. It was late, but this highway wasn't completely deserted, at least, that's what I told myself. After about 20 minutes, a pair of headlights appeared in my rearview mirror. Relief washed over me as the vehicle slowed and pulled up behind me. It was an old pickup truck, the kind with a rusty bumper and dents along the side. A man got out, his hood pulled up against the rain. He walked toward my car, waving. I rolled down the window just a little, enough to hear him but not enough to let the rain in. "Car trouble?" he asked, his voice loud over the storm. "Yeah, it just died on me," I said. "I think it's the battery or something." He leaned down to look inside. His face was hard to see under the hood, but he had a beard and a kind of rough look about him. "Pop the hood," he said. "I'll take a look." Something about him made me hesitate, but I didn't have many options. I reached down and pulled the lever. He walked around to the front of the car, and I could hear him fiddling with the latch. After a minute, he called out, "Yeah, looks like your alternator's shot. You're not going anywhere tonight." I felt my stomach drop. "Can I call a tow truck?" I asked, holding up my phone. "I don't have service out here." He shook his head. "You won't get any this far out. Closest town's about 15 miles back. I can give you a ride if you want." There it was, the thing I'd been dreading. I didn't want to get in his truck. Something about him didn't sit right with me. But what was the alternative? Stay here all night? Walk in the rain? "Thanks, but I think I'll wait," I said, trying to sound polite. "Someone else might come by." He didn't move. He just stood there, staring at me through the rain. "Not many people take this road," he said. "Could be hours before someone else shows up. Maybe longer." "I'll take my chances," I said, a little firmer this time. For a moment, he didn't say anything. Then he closed the hood and walked back toward his truck. I thought that was the end of it, but instead of getting in, he stood by his driver's side door, watching me. I tried not to look, but I could feel his eyes on me. I locked the doors, my heart pounding. He stayed there for what felt like forever, just staring. Finally, he got in his truck and started it up. I breathed a sigh of relief as the headlights swept over my car, and the truck pulled back onto the road. But then, instead of driving away, he stopped about 50 feet ahead. The brake lights glowed red in the rain. He was just sitting there, waiting. My hands were shaking as I tried the ignition again, but the car was still dead. I kept my eyes on the truck, praying he would leave. But he didn't. The driver's side door opened, and he stepped out. This time, he wasn't trying to be friendly. He walked toward my car, his strides deliberate, his shoulders hunched against the rain. My mind was racing. What did he want? Why hadn't he just left? I rolled up the window completely and grabbed my phone again, even though I knew it was useless. He reached my car and banged on the driver's side window, hard enough to make me jump. "Open the door," he shouted. "You're not safe out here." I shook my head, my voice trembling. I'm fine. Please leave. His face twisted, and he pounded on the glass again. You think you're fine? He yelled. You're not. Open the damn door. I screamed, backing away as far as I could. He stepped back and looked around, like he was checking to see if anyone else was coming. Then he moved toward the front of my car again. I couldn't see what he was doing, but I heard a loud metallic clank and the car shifted slightly. He was messing with something under the hood. That's when I saw another pair of headlights coming down the road. Another car was approaching, its beams cutting through the rain. The man froze, then slammed the hood shut and ran back to his truck. He peeled out, the tires splashing water as he sped away. The second car pulled up beside me, and a woman rolled down her window. Are you okay? She asked. I saw him run off. I nodded, though I didn't feel okay. My car's dead, I said. I don't know what to do. Get in, she said. I'll take you to the next town. I hesitated, but she looked sincere, and I didn't want to be alone if that man came back. I grabbed my bag and climbed into our car, my clothes soaking the seat. As we drove away, I kept looking in the rearview mirror, half expecting to see his truck again. But he was gone. When we reached the town, I called a tow truck and the police. They found my car later that night. The alternator wasn't just dead, it had been tampered with. Whatever the man had done under the hood had made sure I wouldn't be driving anywhere. I still don't know what he wanted, but I'm glad I didn't stick around to find out. It had been raining for hours by the time we decided to stop for the night. The forecast had said scattered showers, but it turned into a steady downpour that turned the dirt roads into slippery paths. Our plan was simple: drive out to the woods, set up camp, and get away from everything for a weekend. It was supposed to be a break from work, stress, all that. None of us thought to check if the spot we picked was public land. It just looked like a good place to pitch a tent, and it was getting dark fast. There were 4 of us, me, Jason, Claire, and Matt. We parked near a clearing by the trees. It wasn't an official campsite, but it looked secluded and quiet. We got the tents up quickly despite the rain. The sound of the drops hitting the canvas was loud but kind of calming. After that, we sat around under a tarp Jason had brought, trying to keep the fire going with damp wood. We laughed a bit, told some stories, but we were all soaked, so the fun didn't last long. By 11, we gave up and went to bed. It must have been around 2 in the morning when I woke up. I wasn't sure why at first. The rain had lightened up, just a faint tapping against the tent now. Everything was quiet except for that. I thought maybe I had heard an animal or something, but when I listened closer, I heard voices. Low, angry voices. I unzipped the sleeping bag carefully and leaned toward the tent door, straining to hear. Jason's tent was closest to mine, and I could hear him whispering to someone. I couldn't make out what he was saying, but the tone wasn't good. He sounded scared. Then I heard another voice, deep and sharp, cutting through the rain. You've got no right to be here, it said. I froze. I could tell it wasn't one of us, and it was angry. I peeked through the small mesh window on the tent and saw a flashlight beam swinging around outside. It landed on Jason's face for a second, and he winced. The light moved, and then I saw him, an older man, tall and broad, wearing a camo jacket and a white-brimmed hat. He was holding a rifle. I stayed as still as I could, barely breathing. The man pointed the rifle at the ground near Jason's feet and barked, "You think you can just walk onto someone's property and do whatever you like? Who gave you permission?" Jason stammered something about not knowing, about it being an accident. The man didn't seem to care. His voice got louder. "An accident? You think that makes it okay? You've got 10 seconds to pack up and leave, or I'll make you leave. You hear me?" I wanted to get up, to help Jason somehow, but I was terrified. I didn't know if the man would see me as a threat or if he'd just turn the gun on me too. I stayed crouched in the tent, gripping my phone, even though I had no signal out here. Claire must have heard it too, because I saw the light from her phone flashlight flicker on in her tent. That was a mistake. The man noticed it immediately. "Who else is out here?" he shouted, swinging the rifle toward her tent. He stomped toward it, the beam of his flashlight bouncing wildly as he moved. "Come out. Now!" Jason tried to say something, maybe to calm him down, but the man shoved him backward. Jason stumbled and fell, landing hard in the mud. Claire unzipped her tent slowly and stepped out with her hands up, shaking. Matt's tent was still zipped shut, no movement from inside. He was either frozen like me or still asleep somehow. The man's face was pale and lined, and his eyes were wild. He waved the rifle between Jason and Claire, spitting questions. "How many of you are there? What are you doing here? You spying on me?" Claire stammered something about just camping, just passing through. The man didn't seem to believe her. He kept muttering under his breath, things like, "liars," and "think you can sneak around my land." Then he looked at her tent, then Jason's, then mine. His eyes narrowed. "There's more of you, isn't there? Come out, all of you." I didn't know what to do. If I stayed hidden, he might think we were trying to trick him, but if I came out, I didn't know what he'd do. My heart was pounding so hard it hurt. Finally, I unzipped the tent slowly, keeping my hands visible. I stepped out into the wet grass, my socks soaking through instantly. The man stared at me, his jaw tight. "Another one," he said, almost to himself. He pointed the rifle toward the last tent of Matt's. "What about him?" Before I could answer, Matt's tent unzipped. He came out with his hands up like the rest of us, his face pale and scared. The man stared at all four of us, his flashlight flickering over each of our faces. For a moment, he didn't say anything, just breathed heavily. Then he spat on the ground and said, "You've got 5 minutes. Pack up and get off my land. If I see you here again, I'll shoot first and ask questions later." None of us moved right away. He shouted, "Now," and that got us going. We scrambled to take down the tents, our hands fumbling with the wet fabric and slippery poles. The man stood there the whole time, his rifle resting on his hip, watching us with cold eyes. It took longer than 5 minutes, but he didn't stop us. He just kept muttering to himself, shaking his head like we'd done something personal to him. When we finally had everything packed, we started toward the car. Jason tried to apologize again, but the man cut him off. "Just go," he said, "and don't come back." We didn't need to be told twice. We piled into the car, and Jason started it up, the tires spinning a little in the mud before catching. As we drove away, I looked back and saw the man still standing there, his flashlight beam following us until we were out of sight. We didn't stop driving until we hit the main road, miles away. No one said much after that. We just sat there, soaked and shaken, the rain still pounding on the roof. We knew we'd been lucky. The man could have done a lot worse than yell at us. I still think about him sometimes, the way he looked at us, like we weren't people, just intruders. It makes me wonder what he was so afraid of or what he was hiding. I still can't shake off what happened that weekend. It was supposed to be a relaxing getaway, just a couple of days in the woods with a few friends, nothing special. A chance to get away from the hustle, enjoy some fresh air, and have a break from the usual grind. I'd been hiking a few times before, so I knew what to expect. But that weekend, it turned into something completely different. We drove up on Friday afternoon, just as the sun was starting to set. There were 5 of us, me, my brother James, his girlfriend Sarah, and 2 of our friends, Dan and Laura. We found a spot deep in the woods, far enough away from any major trails. It was quiet, peaceful, just how we wanted it. We set up camp, built a fire, and spent the evening talking, laughing, and drinking beers. We didn't think about much, just enjoying the moment. Saturday was pretty uneventful. We hiked, explored a bit, and spent the day relaxing by the river. We had a good dinner, played some card games, and then went to bed early because we were all exhausted from the hike. The night was quiet, the kind of peaceful silence you can only get when you're far away from city noise. We fell asleep with no problems at all. But when we woke up on Sunday morning, everything felt off. The weather was fine, but there was something in the air that made me uneasy. I couldn't put my finger on it. The others didn't seem to notice, though. We packed up our things, folded the tents, and were about ready to head back to the car. That's when things started to go wrong. We had parked the car just off the main road, about a quarter of a mile from our campsite. It was tucked into a small clearing, hidden enough that we didn't worry about it being visible from the main trail. We all made our way back down the path, talking and laughing, until we came to the clearing. That's when we saw it. The car looked fine from a distance, but as we got closer, I noticed something. The tires. Every single one of them was slashed. Flat as a pancake. And as I walked around the back, I saw the engine hood was open. My heart started to race. I looked at James, who looked just as confused as I felt. "Who the hell would do this?" he muttered, walking toward the hood. I didn't know what to say. It was just wrong. Why would anyone be out here? The place we were camping wasn't exactly easy to get to. It wasn't like someone could just casually wander by. We hadn't seen anyone else on the trails the whole time we were there. It didn't make any sense. James looked under the hood, poking around. "It's tampered with. Someone's been messing with the engine. There's no way this happened overnight." "What do you mean?" Sarah asked, her voice shaky. "What do you think happened?" "I don't know," he said, standing up and wiping his hands on his jeans. "But it's not good. I think we're stuck here." "Stuck?" Dan said, his voice rising. "You're telling me we're stuck out here?" "How?" "We're miles from the nearest town. We can't just walk back." We all stood there, staring at the car in disbelief. I could see the panic creeping into everyone's faces. It was supposed to be a simple trip. We were supposed to drive back and enjoy the rest of the day. But now, we were stranded. And someone had clearly done this on purpose. "We need to call for help," I said, trying to keep calm, even though I could feel my own nerves starting to fray. "Maybe someone can come get us." "Good luck with that," Laura said, holding up her phone. "There's no signal out here. Remember?" She was right. We hadn't had any reception since we started the hike, and now there was no way to contact anyone. It was just the 5 of us, stuck in the middle of nowhere. I paced around the car, trying to think. There had to be something we could do. But when I looked at the damage again, it became clear someone had deliberately destroyed the car. The tires were slashed clean through. The engine was messed with in a way that made it obvious it wasn't some random vandal. This was intentional. Someone wanted us stuck here. I felt the air grow heavier, like the forest around us was closing in. The peaceful getaway had turned into something darker. I couldn't stop thinking about the possibility of whoever had done this still being nearby, watching us, waiting. "We need to figure out what to do," James said. "We can't just sit here." "We could try to hike out," I suggested. It's not far to the road. Maybe we can flag someone down, get a tow truck or something. But no one seemed too keen on that idea. It was starting to get late in the afternoon, and we were already exhausted from the hike the day before. None of us were in any condition to walk the distance, especially with the heavy feeling hanging over us. No one said it, but we all knew it. It wasn't just the car that was messed up. Something was wrong here. Someone had gone out of their way to trap us. We sat around the car for a while, trying to figure out what to do next. It felt like every second that passed, the weight of the situation just kept getting heavier. The trees around us, once just part of a nice forest, now seemed to press in closer. The whole world felt quieter, like we were being watched, even though we didn't see anything out of place. Then, just as we were starting to talk about maybe going on foot, we heard something. A noise. A branch snapping in the woods. We all froze. Everyone turned to look, their eyes wide with the same realization. We weren't alone. For what felt like forever, we stood there, barely breathing, listening. But the noise didn't come again. It could have been an animal, just the wind, or maybe a trick of the mind. But in that moment, it didn't matter. What mattered was that we had no way out. No way to know who or what had done this to us. We made a decision then, even though it felt impossible. We would try to walk out. Stick together. The whole time, I kept glancing over my shoulder, expecting to see someone or something lurking in the shadows. Every crack of a branch, every rustle in the leaves felt like someone was getting closer. It wasn't an easy hike out. It was a long, exhausting trek, made worse by the growing sense of fear that hung over us. But we finally made it to a place where we could get a signal on our phones, and after what felt like hours, we managed to get through to someone who could help. They showed up and towed us back to town. We didn't look back at the woods as we drove away. None of us said much during the ride. We were all just too shaken. To this day, I still don't know who did it or why. But I can't shake the feeling that we were being watched the whole time. We got out safe, yes. But something about that weekend, it wasn't just the car. It was the feeling that we were never meant to leave. It was supposed to be a peaceful weekend getaway, a chance for the group to escape the noise of city life and get back to nature. There were 5 of us, me, my brother, his girlfriend, my best friend, and her cousin. Nothing special, just a weekend hike into some remote area. We'd been planning it for months, picking out a spot we thought would be quiet and secluded. None of us were expecting anything to go wrong. We were just looking forward to some time by the fire, some good food, and maybe a few hikes through the woods. The first day went off without a hitch. We set up camp at a small clearing near a creek, made a fire, and spent the evening talking, cooking dinner, and drinking a little. The place was perfect, quiet, private, just far enough off the trail to feel like we were really away from everything. The forest felt peaceful, even a little magical. At least, that's how I saw it then. But things started to feel off on the second day. We woke up to the sound of birds, but there was something wrong with the quiet. It wasn't the usual kind of quiet you expect in nature, where it's just peaceful and calm. It felt too still, like the air was holding its breath. Still, we brushed it off, made some breakfast, and headed out for a hike. It was a long walk, more than we had planned, but none of us really cared. We were all in good spirits, just enjoying the fresh air. When we got back to camp around late afternoon, something felt strange. The whole area around the clearing seemed darker, even though it was still light outside. I couldn't put my finger on it, but I just felt uneasy. We went about setting up for dinner, but it was hard to shake the feeling. Maybe it was just the tiredness setting in. After we ate, my brother and I decided to take a walk to stretch our legs and clear our heads. The rest of the group stayed by the fire, talking and laughing. It was just a short walk down the trail that led back to the road where we parked. We weren't going to leave camp, just wander a little to get some fresh air. That's when we saw it. About half a mile down the trail, right where the road met the wooded area, there was a gate, rusted, heavy, and completely out of place. It was blocking the path, completely shutting off the only way out. We both stopped dead in our tracks when we saw it. It wasn't there when we first arrived, not even close. We had walked down this same path that morning, and there had been nothing. The road was wide open, just like it should be. But now, in front of us, was a tall, metal gate that looked like it had been there for decades. I thought it was some sort of private property gate, maybe someone who lived nearby had put it up. My brothers suggested it was an old hunting camp or a ranch that used to be around, but I didn't buy it. Something about it didn't feel right. It was too deliberate, like it had been placed there specifically to block us in. We tried to push on the gate, but it was locked, and there were no signs, no markings, nothing to explain why it was there. We looked around for any kind of indication of who might own it, but the woods were completely silent. No houses, no roads, nothing. Just the endless trees on all sides. After a few minutes of trying to figure out how to get through, we decided to head back to camp and tell the others. As we walked back, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched. The woods around us seemed so quiet, but I kept hearing small sounds of branches cracking, the rustle of leaves. I couldn't see anything, but it felt like something was just out of view, lurking. When we got back to the campsite, we told the others about the gate. At first, they didn't believe us. They thought it was some kind of mistake, or maybe a prank. But when we walked them down the trail to show them, the gate was still there. We all stood there for a moment, staring at it, trying to make sense of it. The sunlight was fading fast, and the whole place suddenly felt darker, colder. None of us really knew what to do. We had no way of contacting anyone since we didn't have cell service, and the gate was the only way out. We couldn't just stay here forever. So, we all decided to sleep on it and figure things out in the morning. We made sure to lock up the tent and keep the fire going, but no one felt at ease. Everyone kept glancing at the gate, the darkening woods beyond, like they were expecting something to happen. That night, I couldn't sleep. The sounds in the woods outside the tent were off, almost like something or someone was moving around. I kept hearing footsteps, faint at first, then closer. I thought maybe it was just an animal, but then I realized that these footsteps didn't sound like they were coming from the usual direction. They were too slow, too deliberate. And they seemed to stop when I tried to listen more closely, as if someone was standing perfectly still, waiting for me to look. I tried to shake it off, but I couldn't. Every time I almost drifted off, I'd hear them again, just outside the tent. I got up to check the fire, but it was still going strong. No one else was awake. Everything was quiet again, but I felt it. There was something wrong. In the morning, we packed up our things, trying to figure out what to do. We couldn't just leave the way we came. The gate was still there, locked in place. And there was no way around it. The road behind us was blocked by a thick wall of trees, with no visible way through. We debated for a while on whether to try climbing the gate, but it was too high, and there was no way to know who might be on the other side. After a few hours, we finally made the decision to head deeper into the woods, hoping we could find another way out. But when we turned back onto the main trail, we were met with something even worse. The gate wasn't the only thing blocking us anymore. The whole trail seemed to have been altered, like someone or something had intentionally moved things to keep us from leaving. Rocks were piled up, branches were snapped and laid across the path, and the trees themselves seemed to loom closer, more menacing. I'm not sure how to explain it, but there was no mistaking it. We were being trapped. That's when we realized that someone, or something, didn't want us to leave. The whole experience was so unsettling, and it was clear that we weren't just dealing with a simple gate that had been put up for some unknown reason. Whoever or whatever was out there was making sure we stayed put. We never found out who was behind it all. After hours of wandering the woods, trying every possible path, we managed to find a back trail that led us to a neighboring road. We made it out, but the whole time, I couldn't shake the feeling that someone was watching us, waiting for us to slip up. Every sound, every crack of a twig, every rustle in the trees made my heart race. I don't know if we were just unlucky or if it was something more, but I'll never forget that locked gate or the feeling of being trapped out there, helpless, with no idea who or what was keeping us from leaving. And I'll never go back to that place again. I went out camping by myself for the first time in a long time. I usually went with a group, but I had been feeling kind of drained from everything and thought some quiet time would help. It was a spot I'd been to before, not far from a trailhead. It wasn't an official campground, but it was a clear area near a creek tucked into the woods. I set up my tent, had a quick meal, and just sat by the fire for a while, listening to the sounds of the forest. The weather was good, cool, no rain, and the stars were out. I turned in early, around 9 or so. I was tired from hiking in and setting up camp, and honestly, I was looking forward to a good night's sleep. I had packed light, just a small tent, a sleeping bag, and a few supplies. I kept my food in a bag tied up in a tree, about 20 feet from the campsite, like I'd always been told to do. You don't want animals getting into it. I woke up later, and at first, I wasn't sure why. My eyes opened in the dark, and I just lay there, trying to figure out what had woken me up. Then I heard a low, crunching sound, like something heavy stepping on twigs and leaves. It was close. My tent was small, with only a thin layer of fabric between me and whatever was out there, and I could hear every little sound. The crunching stopped for a moment, and I held my breath. Then I heard another noise, a deep, wet snuffling sound. It was loud, and it sent a cold shock through me. I knew right away what it was. A bear. There was no mistaking it. My heart started pounding. I lay as still as I could, staring up at the roof of the tent, listening. The bear moved closer, and I heard the sound of my food bag being torn at. The rope I'd used to hang it up must not have been high enough. I felt stupid for not checking it better, but now it didn't matter. All I could think was that it was right there, and if it wanted to, it could easily come toward the tent next. The sound of the bear tearing into the bag went on for what felt like forever. It huffed and grunted, and every so often, there was a loud crunch as it bit into something. I was too scared to move, even though I knew I should try to make noise or do something to scare it off. But what if that just made it mad? I didn't have anything to protect myself, no gun or bear spray, just a small camping knife that was still in my backpack. Even if I had it in my hand, I knew it wouldn't do much. I thought about trying to reach for my phone to check the time, but it was in the corner of the tent, and I didn't dare move. I didn't even want to unzip the sleeping bag. I just stayed frozen, listening. My whole body felt tense, like my muscles were locked up, and every little sound the bear made seemed to echo inside my head. At one point, I heard it moving again. The heavy steps came closer, slow and deliberate. I could feel the vibrations in the ground, just faint but there. It was coming toward the tent. My chest felt tight, and I thought I might stop breathing altogether. I squeezed my eyes shut, as if that would somehow help. The bear sniffed loudly, right next to the tent. I could hear it so clearly that I felt like I could picture it in my head, its nose brushing against the fabric, the sound of its breath, low and rumbling. My mind kept racing, imagining what would happen if it decided to push through. I could feel tears starting to well up, but I didn't move. I just kept telling myself to stay still, to stay quiet, even though every instinct was screaming at me to run. The bear circled the tent, slow and steady. I could hear its claws scraping the ground as it moved, and every step felt like it lasted an eternity. At one point, it stopped, and I thought maybe it had gone back to the food. But then I heard it again, closer this time, its breath heavy and loud. I couldn't tell how long it stayed near the tent. Time felt stretched out and strange, like hours were passing even though it might have only been minutes. Finally, the bear let out a low grunt and moved away. I could hear it walking back toward where the food bag had been, the steps growing fainter. I didn't move. I stayed curled up in the sleeping bag, my fists clenched so tight that my hands were sore. I was too scared to do anything, too scared to even think clearly. The noises from the bear went on for a while longer, but they were farther away now. Eventually, they stopped altogether. I didn't sleep the rest of the night. I just lay there, every little creak or rustle making my heart race all over again. When the first light started to come through the tent, I finally dared to unzip it and look outside. The food bag was gone, completely torn off the rope and dragged away somewhere. There were deep claw marks in the dirt and mud near the tree, and even some on the tree trunk itself. I packed up as fast as I could. My hands were shaking the whole time, and I kept looking around, expecting to see the bear coming back. By the time I was on the trail heading back to my car, the sun was fully up, but I still couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. Every little noise in the woods made me jump. When I finally got back to my car and locked the doors, I felt like I could breathe again. I sat there for a long time before I started the engine, just trying to calm down. Even now, thinking about it makes my stomach twist. It's not like I was attacked or anything, but being that close to something so powerful and knowing there's nothing you can do, it stays with you. It makes you feel small. The rain started coming down just after I left the grocery store, heavier than I expected. I had planned to walk the 2 miles back home. It wasn't far, and I liked the fresh air, but this wasn't just a light drizzle. It was pouring, cold and relentless, soaking me through in minutes. I had no umbrella, just a bag of groceries I was now holding against my chest to keep dry. I hurried along the sidewalk, keeping my head down against the wind, when I saw the bus stop up ahead. It wasn't much, just a small glass shelter with a bench inside, but it would keep the rain off. I picked up my pace, my shoes squelching with every step, and ducked under the awning with a sigh of relief. The rain hammered against the roof and the glass walls, loud and unrelenting. I was about to set my bag down and check my phone when I noticed I wasn't alone. There was someone else there, sitting on the bench, a man. He looked up when I entered, his face partially hidden by the hood of his jacket. He didn't say anything, just stared at me with a blank expression. His clothes were wet, his jeans dark with rainwater, and his hands were shoved deep into his pockets. Something about the way he was sitting, hunched forward with his legs spread wide, made him seem bigger than he really was. I nodded to him, not sure what else to do, and stood off to the side, leaning against the glass. There wasn't much room under the awning, and I didn't want to crowd him. The rain was coming in sideways, though, and the wind kept blowing it against my legs. I shuffled closer to the center, trying to stay dry. He didn't move or look away, and I could feel his eyes on me as I adjusted my bag and wiped the water off my face. It was awkward, but I tried to ignore it. Maybe he was just tired or cold. We were both stuck here, after all, waiting for the rain to let up. After a few minutes, he spoke. "You live around here?" he asked, his voice low and rough. The question caught me off guard. It wasn't an unusual thing to ask, but there was something about the way he said it that made my stomach tighten. I hesitated before answering, keeping my voice casual. Yeah, not far, I said. Just waiting out the rain. He nodded slowly, like he was thinking about that. His eyes stayed on me, unblinking. I looked away, pretending to check my phone, but the screen was too wet to work. I shoved it back in my pocket and tried to focus on the rain instead of the strange tension in the air. You shouldn't be out here alone, he said after a long pause. I glanced at him, unsure if he was trying to be helpful or threatening. His tone was flat, hard to read. I forced a small smile, not wanting to make things worse. It's just rain, I said. I'll be fine. He didn't respond. Instead, he leaned back on the bench, stretching his legs out in front of him. His boots were caked with mud, leaving streaks on the floor. He was taking up most of the space now, and I could feel the cold spray of the rain against my back as I tried to stay out of his way. The silence stretched on, heavy and uncomfortable. I could feel my pulse quicken, the hairs on my neck standing up. There was something off about him, something I couldn't put into words. I thought about leaving, but the rain was still coming down hard, and I didn't want to get soaked again. Then he stood up. It wasn't a sudden movement, but it made me flinch anyway. He was taller than I'd realized, broad-shouldered and solid. He stepped closer, his hands still in his pockets, and I pressed myself against the glass, trying to keep some distance between us. You're taking up a lot of room, he said, his voice sharper now. I was here first. I blinked at him, confused. There was plenty of room in the shelter, enough for both of us. But the way he was looking at me, his eyes narrowing, made it clear he didn't want me there. I'm not trying to bother you, I said carefully. I'll stay over here. He didn't move, just stood there, blocking the exit. The rain was pouring behind him, a solid wall of water. My heart was racing now, and I could feel the panic building in my chest. I think you should go, he said, his voice cold. I swallowed hard, trying to keep my breathing steady. My mind was racing, trying to figure out what to do. I didn't want to escalate things, but I also didn't want to step out into the storm, leaving myself vulnerable. Look, I'm just waiting for the rain to stop, I said. I'll be gone as soon as it lets up. He didn't respond. Instead, he took another step closer, and I realized just how trapped I was. The shelter was small, the glass walls offering no escape. I could see the rainwater pooling at the edges, dripping onto the floor. You don't belong here, he said, his voice low and menacing. I didn't know what he meant, but the way he said it sent a chill down my spine. My hands tightened around my bag, the only thing I had to defend myself with. Please, I said, my voice shaking. I don't want any trouble. He smirked at that, a cruel twist of his lips. Trouble, he said, his tone mocking. You think I'm trouble? Before I could respond, he lunged forward, grabbing my arm. His grip was strong, his fingers digging into my skin. I tried to pull away, but he held on tight, his face inches from mine. You need to learn some respect, he hissed. I didn't think. I swung my bag at him, the weight of the groceries knocking him off balance. He stumbled back, letting go of my arm, and I took the opportunity to push past him, running out into the rain. The cold water hit me like a wall, but I didn't stop. I ran as fast as I could, my heart pounding in my chest. I didn't look back, too afraid of what I might see. The rain blurred everything, the streetlights casting faint glows in the darkness. I didn't stop until I reached the main road, where cars were passing by, their headlights cutting through the storm. I flagged down a driver, my voice barely audible over the rain, and begged them to help. They let me in, and I explained what had happened as they drove me to safety. By the time the police arrived at the bus stop, the man was gone. I still don't know what he wanted or what he might have done if I hadn't fought back. But I can't forget the look in his eyes, the way he seemed to enjoy the fear he was causing. Now, every time it rains, I can't help but think about that night and wonder if he's still out there, waiting for someone else to cross his path. I never thought I'd be writing something like this. I've always loved my dog. Her name's Bella, a small but energetic little thing, a mix of terrier and something else, I think. She was always by my side, whether I was out for a walk or curled up on the couch watching TV. She was just my constant, you know? So, when she went missing, it felt like I had lost a part of myself. It all started one Tuesday afternoon. I had just finished work, and as usual, I let Bella out in the backyard. We lived in a quiet neighborhood, and the backyard was fenced in. She never strayed far, just sniffing around the yard, chasing a few squirrels, maybe barking at the neighbors as they walked by. So, when I went inside to grab something to drink, I didn't think anything of it. When I went back outside about 10 minutes later, Bella was gone. I didn't panic at first. I thought maybe she had squeezed through the fence somehow or wandered into the front yard. I checked there, called her name, and when she didn't come, I went out into the street, asking anyone nearby if they'd seen her. A couple of neighbors told me they hadn't seen her, but that didn't mean much. She was a quiet dog, so maybe they just didn't notice. By sunset, I was getting worried. I posted on the local neighborhood Facebook group, asking if anyone had seen her. I drove around the block a few times, hoping to see her running around or just sitting by someone's door, like she sometimes did when she was waiting for me to come home. It wasn't until later that night when I started feeling like something was wrong. The next day, I woke up early, hoping to catch Bella wandering around like she sometimes did. But nothing. By then, I was frantic. I printed out flyers, asked around, even went door to door to my neighbors. No one had seen her, and no one had any idea where she could have gone. It was about 2 days after she went missing that I started noticing something odd. There was a neighbor down the street, Mr. Porter. He was a quiet guy, lived alone, and didn't really talk to anyone much. I'd always waved to him when I passed by, but that was about it. I had never really had any reason to think about him until now. I don't know why, but something about the way he acted caught my attention. For the past 2 days, whenever I passed his house, I noticed that his blinds were always pulled tight. It wasn't like him to keep his windows covered. He usually had them open, letting in the light. And every time I walked by, I could see the shadow of him moving inside, like he was standing still, just watching. I don't know what exactly made me suspicious, but the feeling only grew. So, on the 3rd day, after exhausting every other option, I decided to stop by his house. I had to know if he'd seen anything or heard anything about Bella. I had no plan beyond just asking, but the way he was acting made me uneasy, so I thought maybe it was worth a shot. I knocked on his door. No answer. I knocked again, a little louder this time. Still nothing. I started to turn around, figuring I'd leave a note and try again later, but then I heard the sound of footsteps behind me. "Hello?" Mr. Porter's voice startled me. I turned around quickly, and he was standing there, looking at me from the doorway. He had a strange expression on his face, almost like he was trying to hide something, or maybe it was just my nerves getting to me. "I'm sorry to bother you, Mr. Porter," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. but I was wondering if you'd seen my dog, Bella. She's been missing for a few days." He paused for a moment before answering, which felt a little too long. "No, I haven't seen anything," he said, his eyes flicking down to the ground. "Sorry to hear that. You should try the animal shelter." I nodded, thinking maybe I had just read into his behavior. People are weird sometimes, right? But as I was about to leave, something made me hesitate. "Wait," I said, not knowing exactly what made me ask, "is there any chance I could take a quick look around your yard? I'm just trying to track down where she might have gone." Mr. Porter's expression changed. He looked uncomfortable, but after a long, awkward silence, he finally said, "Sure, I guess. But there's really no reason to." Before he could finish his sentence, I saw something in the corner of my eye. A shadow. The shadow of something small, moving behind the thick hedge that separated his backyard from the house. "Is that?" I started, but he quickly shut the door behind him, cutting me off. "I wouldn't bother," he said, his voice low and tense now. "You can't just go peeking around people's property." At that moment, I could feel my heart rate pick up. Something wasn't right. Why was he acting like that? Why didn't he want me to look behind the hedge? "I'll be quick," I said, not waiting for him to stop me. I didn't know what was going on, but everything inside me screamed that I needed to see what was behind that hedge. I walked around to the side of his house, and when I pushed through the bushes, my breath caught in my throat. Bella was there, but she wasn't free. She was locked in a small cage, barely big enough for her to move around in. Her fur was matted, and she was trembling, looking up at me with big, scared eyes. My heart stopped for a moment as I rushed over to the cage. "Bella," I whispered, my voice breaking. "Oh my God, Bella." Before I could reach for the latch to open the cage, I heard Mr. Porter behind me, his voice dangerously calm. "I wouldn't do that if I were you." I turned around, and there he was, standing at the corner of the house, his arms crossed, blocking my way back. "You need to leave," he said, his voice cold now. "I don't like being disturbed." I was frozen for a second, unsure of what to do. My dog was right there, and I couldn't just leave her. But I also had no idea what Mr. Porter was capable of. I took a deep breath and backed away slowly, my hand still reaching for the cage. "I'm calling the cops," I said, my voice trembling. He didn't move, but he didn't stop me either. I turned and ran back to my house, barely able to breathe with the shock and fear. As soon as I was inside, I dialed 911. It felt like hours until the police finally arrived, but when they did, they went to his house, and soon enough, they came back with Bella, safe but terrified. Mr. Porter was arrested, and it turned out that he'd been keeping her and other pets locked up in his house for months, taking them from yards when people weren't paying attention. He wasn't even the least bit remorseful when the police questioned him. I've never felt so shaken in my life, and I'll never understand why he did it or why he chose my Bella. But I'm just so grateful that I trusted my gut that day. Bella's home now, and I'll never take my eyes off her again. I hope I never run into anyone like Mr. Porter again.